Morning, 48 hours after the world exploded. 48 hours that seem like forever. New York City struggles to get back on its feet. For many, today is the first day back on the job, the first attempt at returning to life as it was. But how is that even possible?
Nothing could be quite normal, but this seems much more normal than it was yesterday.
There's no energy. People are just kind of like sleepwalking.
For tens of thousands of workers here, there is simply no office to go to. Their buildings reduced to rubble or crumbling masonry. The Twin Towers, gone. The 47-story tower at 7 World Trade Center, toppled. The 54-story tower at 1 Liberty Plaza, 3 blocks from the Trade Center, disintegrating. And numerous other buildings uninhabitable. In the tangled, still smoldering wreckage of the Trade Center towers, emergency teams continue their around-the-clock work. At about 10 a.m., the reason they are driving themselves to exhaustion.
I believe that there's a good possibility that there's people in that building that are alive, and that's why we are treating this as a rescue effort still. This is not a recovery. We are trying to get in every possible void, every possible area that we can to try to see if there are people that we can save.
But this morning's statistics threaten to overwhelm the flickering hopes of finding many alive amidst the tons of debris. New York Mayor Giuliani.
We now have a count of 94 bodies that have been recovered, 46 of which have been identified. We have the gruesome and horrible situation that in many cases we recover only parts of bodies, and we have 70 in that category.
Another number speaks graphically to the carnage. To hold all those pieces of the human wreckage, the mayor tells reporters that the city has waiting 30,000 body bags. And then there is the list of the missing.
We have 4,763 people on the missing persons list. That's a list that's as inclusive as we can make it. It includes the plane itself, the manifest. It includes people that have been identified to us by family members.
And all over the city, pictures handed out by desperate families. This is Tim Stout, a father of 3 who was working on the 103rd floor of the North Tower, one of 680 missing from his company alone. Michael Lepore's office was on the 97th floor. Missing from his firm, another 700. Their families are hoping to find them, even if it's in a hospital bed. That's where Arthur Del Bianco's family found him, his leg broken, his respect unbounded for the courage of the rescuers.
The firemen were phenomenal. They're true heroes. They were there, they went back in over and over again. Even after the first building started coming down, those guys went back inside. They were back inside.
Do you have the sense that there are still people underground?
I want to believe that there's still people alive.
Transportation Secretary Norm Mineta, 10:30 this morning. The first official word that planes will soon be flying again.
Effective 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time today, our national airspace system will reopen to commercial aviation.
But Secretary Mineta says there will be new precautions.
From this day forward, we are operating with tightened security.
More extensive passenger screening, an end to curbside check-in, more parking restrictions, possible armed marshals on flights. Less convenience, but more safety.
Again, I strongly urge all passengers to allow plenty of time to deal with the heightened security procedures and also to exercise patience with airport and airline employees and security personnel.
11 a.m. President Bush calls New York, commending officials there and telling them he will visit the stricken city tomorrow.
I weep and mourn with America. I'm going to a hospital right after this to comfort families. I wish I could comfort every single family whose lives have been affected. But make no mistake about it, my resolve is steady and strong about winning this war that has been declared on America. It's a new kind of war. And I understand it's a new kind of war. And this government will adjust. And this government will call others to join us to make sure this act, these acts, the people who conducted these acts, and those who harbor them are held accountable for their actions.
After the call, the president turns to reporters with a message for America, its allies, and its enemies.
The nation must understand this is now the focus of my administration. We will be very much engaged in domestic policy, of course. I look forward to working with Congress on a variety of issues. But now that war has been declared on us, we will lead the world to victory.
From the commander-in-chief, determination and emotion.
Could you give us a sense as to what kind of prayers you are thinking and where your heart is for yourself as you work on that?
I think about myself right now. I think about the families, the children. I'm a loving guy, and I'm also someone, however, who's got a job to do, and I intend to do it. And this is a terrible moment, but this country will not relent until we have saved ourselves and others from the terrible tragedy that came upon America.
By early afternoon, new details on the massive investigation into the attacks, with word from the Attorney General that the public is pitching in.
The website, which was opened virtually immediately after the crisis, has received more than 22,700 suggested tips.
With leads pouring in, investigators say they are now able to reconstruct the terrorist operation with names and numbers.
The total number of hijackers on the 4 planes that crashed was at least 18. 2 planes had 5 hijackers and 2 other planes had 4 hijackers each.
And there's new information from Boston, where investigators say the hijackers boarded their planes with help from a local terrorist cell. NBC's Chris Hansen.
That a ramp pass was found in a rental car here at Logan Airport that has been linked to 2 of the hijacked suspects. Now, a ramp pass, as its name suggests, is a pass that gives someone access to restricted areas of the airport. Now, this indicates 2 things. 1, that the suspects were casing out the airport in the days before the hijacking, and 2, that perhaps the hijacked suspects had inside help here at the airport.
By mid-afternoon, disturbing news. U.S. officials tell NBC's Andrea Mitchell that other potential hijackers tied in with Tuesday's terrorist operation are still out there.
So we know that there were 18 who went down with those 4 planes, but what I'm now being told is that there were more trained pilots.
Before the day is out, government sources tell NBC News they have concluded that Osama bin Laden is directly responsible for the attacks. Also late today, a major development. Recovered and on its way to Washington, the black box from the plane that went down in Pennsylvania. As evening approaches, the impact of the terrorist attacks is clear. It's been a day of bomb scares and evacuations at New York's Grand Central Station, at Penn Station, LaGuardia Airport, and Rockefeller Center. In Washington, the U.S. Capitol is evacuated, even as congressmen are being briefed on the terrorist attacks. And word that as a precautionary measure, Vice President Cheney is being moved out of Washington to Camp David.
And that's where we stood late today. We call your attention to this. Note the lightning and thunder and the rain on our camera pointing across the Hudson to the scene of the search and rescue effort in New York. We are in the midst of a pretty healthy and boisterous thunderstorm here in New York that is expected to dump quite a bit of rain on the New York metropolitan area, coming in 2 waves. And right now we're really at the height of this thunderstorm cell that's crossing over the Hudson into the city. Really, rain in this amount will not be welcome over in New York. A little bit to dampen the dust, perhaps, but this will be a heavy rain. It will add weight to the debris and materials already on top. It'll make getting around tough, and of course it just makes working conditions unpleasant for the big-hearted volunteers who have turned out by the hundreds from just about every one of the lower 48 states, every fire company, every police precinct, just by the battalion in New York, over there helping out, doing the silent work that is needed for the 4,700 people missing in New York, say nothing of the similar situation going on at the Pentagon. Much talk there at the end of the Stone Phillips piece about President Bush, his day of great emotion. We have a situation where the Vice President and President have been separated. The Vice President flown out of Washington to the safety of the presidential retreat, Camp David in the Catoctin Mountain Range of Maryland. We are joined by senior political analyst Lawrence O'Donnell. Lawrence, you and I had a discussion several hours ago. I'd like to continue now about the president's handling specifically of this crisis. Opinion polls giving him a staggering 88% approval. Of course, Americans are famous for this, the resolve, the support they throw behind the chief executive. Every chief executive initially after crisis when the chips are down for the United States.
Brian, these are more than approval ratings. They are authorization ratings, if you will. This is the public authorizing this president now to act as the chief executive, as the commander-in-chief, and make the executive decisions necessary to formulate this country's response. And there's no trace anywhere in this polling of the last 24 hours that this was a president who was barely elected with barely 50% of the vote. This is the defining moment for this presidency. The country has known for some time now that this is not our most eloquent, most articulate president. I don't think that's the expectation, and certainly would not be after the first 2 days of this, where the president has given very short statements, statements that have included some very dramatic language, like act of war, which is not just dramatic language, but a statement of the size of the response this president must be contemplating. But the inside game is what counts. It's what the public will be ultimately judging this presidency on, not on his rhetoric, and that's a judgment they won't be able to make for several months.
He's a rather taciturn man. He follows in office, of course, a man who wore his emotions on his sleeve, Bill Clinton, and had ample chance in 2 terms to show them. Someone who saw that tape of George W. Bush in the Oval Office today said to me, "This is the most I've liked him since he became president. It's the most he's shown of his humanity." And Lawrence, it is a tricky job driving the United States during tough times.
And Brian, this is obviously a very emotional man, a genuinely emotional man. And there was always the question, although Bill Clinton could emote, there was always that question of how genuine was it. And I think we've all known people, from the Great Plains, people from Texas, people from the kinds of places that George W. Bush is from, who are in fact very emotional people, and therefore much more protective of the revelation of emotion, much more careful about straying into areas where they might crack. And you see, as soon as President Bush started to refer to families of victims in this situation, he really could not hold himself together in the way that we have always seen him do it in the past. It could just be that he is in fact a very emotional man and stays away from rhetoric and from language that will take him into a zone where he doesn't think he'll be able to control how he is going to present himself.
Lawrence, devil's advocate, and I'll be unabashed about this, are there doubts about this president that would require him, another way of wording it, would he be well counseled to bring in former chief executives, his father, Messrs. Ford and Carter, to show the nation that these former chiefs are united in whatever the next step is going to be, whatever it is the United States decides to do, proceeding against this other nation, entity, terrorist, cell, or state?
Well, in perception terms, it's a tricky decision, Brian, because it would leave open the possible perception that, well, maybe he isn't really up to the job. He actually has to get the rest of them in here to give him this kind of guidance. We know he's already spoken to the first President Bush, who's spoken to his father, who would be the president, the former president that really anyone in office at this point should first reach out to. This was the commander-in-chief of Desert Storm. This is a former chief, head of the Central Intelligence Agency, a former vice president and president. There's no one really with more experience in dealing with the Joint Chiefs, dealing with vying departments, State Department, Defense Department. A phone call, a conversation with President George Bush, George Herbert Walker Bush, is a very good idea. He'll have that access. We know that. But he also has the A-team of foreign policy and defense policy makers there. There was no question that in the campaign, we knew for some time that Colin Powell was going to be Secretary of State, and the rest of the cabinet took shape in a way that is a very, very strong team on foreign policy and on defense strategy. So I don't think there are very many people sitting out there saying, well, gee, if there had been a Democratic administration, they would have had a better team in there supporting the president in his decision-making right now. So I think the public knows this is a team effort, that the menu of choice presented to a president in a situation like this is not a very large menu. It's a very narrow set of possible options. Usually one looks like the reasonable option to take. And so that's why most presidents in these situations end up making what you could call nonpartisan choices. They make choices that are similar. The Democrat makes choices that are similar to the one the Republican made in a similar situation. There is no similar situation here. This will be a larger response. We know that already. We have that coming out of the Defense Department on the record. This president's choice will be the defining choice, in fact, of what the American government is capable of in the 21st century by way of defending itself against the real threats of the 21st century.
Finally, Lawrence, the American people will want shared with them the evidence. What evidence have you that you're going on to launch this attack? One historian, and I raise calling the other presidents together because it was raised in a conversation last night, another historian suggested an address to a joint session of Congress.
There will surely be an address to the joint session of Congress. The question is when. George W. Bush, among his many unusual qualities as a politician, is he is an extremely patient and extremely deliberate politician. He does not seem to worry about making sure the public is with him every minute of the day, making sure the public knows exactly and supports him. If you watch the way he pursued his agenda on the tax cut, for example, early in the game it was thought that, well, this thing doesn't really have a chance, and he just went about it in an extremely deliberate way that seemed to have an attitude of, you just watch how this thing turns out and judge me then. You know, I won't give stirring speeches about the tax cut as we move along, but watch what I get in the end. That seems so far to be his attitude in the way he's going to play this. I don't think he's going to say anything publicly 1 minute before he's absolutely certain that it is totally safe and reasonable to say something publicly. So he might delay the address to a joint session longer than possibly any other president would in a situation like this, but there will definitely be one, and he will have continuing addresses to the nation from his desk at the Oval Office, 5-minute statements, 10-minute statements, and will get the public up to speed, according to his judgment, on exactly where they need to be, when they need to be, and not 1 minute before.
Senior political analyst Lawrence O'Donnell, as always. Lawrence, thank you for that. An already jittery nation tried to get back into the airline business today. The FAA put commercial flights back into the air only to stop everything in and out of New York because 2 arrests or detainments were made. 2 groups of people were taken from New York's LaGuardia and Kennedy Airport. Both, according to law enforcement sources, were trying to apparently fake their way on to transcontinental commercial flights. One of the worst theories was that it was trying to be attempted again, that perhaps it was 2 more groups of would-be hijackers. For whatever reason, the 2 groups detained, we have heard nothing on their whereabouts or disposition. There were armed guards visible on the roof of JFK Airport. And earlier this evening, we spoke with a passenger who was on an American Airlines flight, loaded up and ready to fly from New York's JFK to Los Angeles LAX, and he picks up the story seated in the rear of the airplane tonight.
It starts with trying to get home to Los Angeles after being in New York for at least 2 weeks about now.
And you're trying to get on a commercial flight, and what happens?
I was on American's Flight 133 bound for LA, which is supposed to be the first American flight to leave JFK at 4 o'clock this afternoon. We sat on the tarmac for about 3 hours to 4 hours. They finally cleared us to leave the gate. And next thing we know, there were at least probably half a dozen to a dozen armed SWAT team gunmen that stormed through the back of the plane. They had us put our heads into crash position, and they dragged out at least one potential terrorist, and we think as many as 3.
Wow. Now you're sitting there with a partial plane load, full plane load worth of passengers waiting to go to Los Angeles, and given the climate right now, actually you're on the ground in a city where the World Trade Center is gone. That must have scared the hell out of everybody.
It was surreal. I mean, it really brought terrorism within arm's reach. I mean, you see these scenes on TV, but it's a whole different experience when it's only a heartbeat away. And everyone was very calm before it happened. Everyone was actually looking forward to getting home, and it really changed the whole equilibrium of the plane once this all happened.
I bet it did. How much were you told in advance about the delay, and how much were you ever told about what you had just witnessed?
It all happened very fast. The only hint actually we didn't think anything was going to happen. When they told us we were going to push back from the gate, they gave us a heads up that there might be some police cars that might escort us to the end of the runway for security reasons, which no one really, actually everyone thought that was actually pretty exciting. But then obviously it was a smokescreen for the raid.
So they came in and plucked from your midst, how many individuals did you say?
Well, I saw at least one, but then actually it was hard to sort of see because we were all sort of in crash position, so you sort of saw things in shadows sort of out of the corner of your eye. But in talking to some folks that were actually sitting right next to the passengers that were extracted, it turns out, according to them, that there were 2 women and one gentleman.
Had you seen any words exchanged prior to this with those passengers and members of the flight crew?
Not at all. I was actually sitting in the back of the plane, about 3 rows from the very back, and it was just, we don't even really know exactly which seats those passengers were in. They were in the front end of the coach section of the plane.
Because we have learned since that a total of 8 people were either arrested or detained. All of them seem to have a common thread: impersonating airline employees, telling one story only for officials to learn that the truth was something else. And the wildest theory of the afternoon was that perhaps another set of potential hijackers was going to try the same thing with a commercial airline. Final question to you is, what was security like when you finally got to JFK and thought you were going to take a commercial flight? Start at the curb when you arrive at the airport. What was different than flying normally?
Well, there was definitely no curbside check-in, and everything actually seemed very calm and process-oriented checking in. And it was actually pretty streamlined, actually getting your ticket. Where I got a little bit nervous was actually at the X-ray and security gateway. They certainly were wanding us and doing some extra sort of metal detection, but there was certainly, at least from my individual experience, there wasn't any sort of extra digging through bags, and it seemed very hurried, like some people were actually even being able to sort of slip through without being wanted. So then I compared notes with some other folks that were sitting next to me on the flight, and they also sort of felt that security wasn't as tight as we necessarily expected.
Airline passenger Jim Olson, who still is not in Los Angeles, and tonight apparently never made it from New York to LA on that American Airlines flight. Another outgrowth of all of this coming up in just a moment when we talk about all the cancellations. It is 1:30 a.m. In the East, Friday morning already, and let us take a look at the stories making news at the bottom of the hour. The rescue hopes are dimming with each passing hour. The list of the missing, 4,700 names long. Right now, a rather healthy rainstorm on top of the island of Manhattan is not helping the effort at all. Each day, with each passing day, the odds of live rescues decrease. There are every few hours stories that noises are heard, that people are brought out of the wreckage. Some of them turn out to be rumors. That is our rain-covered lens trained across the Hudson at the rescue site now. The dust plume has been tamped down a bit by the rain shower. The Pentagon is discussing a sustained response from the #2 man there today. There was talk of ending states that are seen to be enemies of the United States. That would mean more than a sustained response, an invasion force, an occupation force, ground troops, an air attack. They say to battle terrorism, they will need an all-out U.S. military effort, and there are talks with Congress about the language the president would need. The needs $40 billion to begin to fix what is broken in America after this attack. Finally, Wall Street is having set a record for the longest time that trading has ever been suspended in this nation's history. They will resume trading on Monday. The problems have been infrastructure, electronic circuitry, and simply getting employees to the job at their Wall Street brokerage houses. Since Lower Manhattan, everything under 14th Street has really been out of business, out of commission. Now to the world of professional sports, the leisure time of Americans. Everything has been canceled this coming weekend. Baseball, basketball. Pardon me, the control room is... Right, okay. Professional sports, as I was saying, everything has been canceled this coming weekend. The planned NASCAR race, professional baseball, basketball, golf, stadiums will be empty, and we are joined from Denver by Sports Illustrated columnist Rick Riley. Rick, where do you come down on the decision nationwide and virtually sport to sport to cancel it all?
You know, I know it's a tough decision. I wanted them to play. I felt like if I were a victim's family, those people could use a break on a Sunday. They've been grieving and will have been grieving, what, for 5 days. And, you know, one thing athletes can do is offer this up. Doesn't mean it's important. It doesn't mean it matters. But it is a break. It's a diversion. Emmitt Smith of the Cowboys was saying the same thing. Why not play, do what we do, just as a musician does what he does, a painter does what he, and offer this up as a breather for these people. And I bet if you polled those families, they would say, play, give us something, give us a little joy. And I think sports can do that. Sports is never really about the game. It's how often do we have a chance to all get together in a stadium, stand up, sing the national anthem, hug. Instead of wearing our team colors, wear the red, white, and blue. There's a lot of positive could have come out of games this weekend.
Rick, we had Bob Costas on earlier this evening, and just recalling the conversation, he brought up two aspects. Number one, the incongruity of watching what has become the celebration after each and every play in the NFL, for starters, feeling good generally, and second, gathering large numbers of Americans anywhere in public this weekend.
Well, what are you going to do? You're going to let them grip you in the fear? That's exactly what the terrorists wanted. They want to psychologically screw with our minds, and that's what they want. They want us all to be afraid to get on planes. They want us all to be afraid to gather in stadiums. How is it any less or more dangerous than it was last week? How is it more dangerous than it will be next week when you know they're going to play? So what I say is don't give in to them. Somewhere I want Osama bin Laden to be in a bunker in Kabul or wherever, and to turn on that little television set, even on Saturday when there's going to be some college football played, and look and expect to see rubble and tears and blackness, and instead see people standing up, singing, cheering, and hugging. To me, that's not such a bad thing.
The current commissioner of the NFL, Mr. Tagliabue, said today that it was concerns over air travel that made up most of his decision. And it was the late, great Pete Rozelle who said that his biggest regret ever was playing football, allowing the NFL to play on the weekend after John F. Kennedy's death back in 1963, and that, I guess, was on a lot of people's minds today.
Yeah, but that was 48 hours. This is 5 days later. And, you know, I understand if players didn't want to play out of respect for the victims, and I mean, I can see that. But you know, Brian, these guys get on planes that are owned by their own owners. They know those pilots for 10, 12 years. Those planes would have been gone over with dogs and fine-tooth combs. And it would be only team members, wives, coaches, and trainers. It's not like, you know, the guy that has to go out now tomorrow and start selling computer parts again. He doesn't know what he's into. These are controlled planes leaving from private air. I personally think that's a fearful answer. And I was sorry to see Commissioner Tagliabue bring that up, because I don't want to show this country. You know, George Bush said, let's stand up. Hey, you know, you sucker punched us, but you didn't break us. Let's stand up for what we believe in. They hate everything about Americans. Let's be Americans. What's more American than a football game on a Saturday afternoon or a Sunday afternoon? What's more American than celebrating what we're about? And I'm not saying it's important, but I don't think it's in bad taste. And I think it could have done the victims and their families and the whole country some good.
Do you have any doubt that by Sunday, Americans with a remote will be looking for some relief on the screen from what we're sitting here talking about now?
I'll tell you, you know, I've been watching you, I've been watching everybody nonstop, and I got to get some fresh air. I mean, I know what you mean. There's got to be a little relief here. There's only, you know, I've heard so many guys get on NBC and MSNBC and say, our lives have totally changed. From now on, we're living in, no, we're not. We live the greatest lifestyle in the world. Yeah, it's going to be a little different going to airports, but our lives haven't changed, and I don't want them to change. I want to live the same great life we've all been living, and that includes football and choices and 1,000 channels and 1,000 movies. You know, we don't have to suddenly become gripped with the fear that these guys stuck us with Tuesday. I say we stand up and be who we are and show them that, hey, you got in a good punch, now we're going to come after you, and we're not scared.
Rick, thanks for coming on tonight. Rick Riley from Sports Illustrated on this weekend full of cancellations we're facing. Here in the New York metropolitan area after the attack and destruction of the World Trade Center, you hear over and over the Broadway title and the expression 6 degrees of separation. Everyone you run into, every family in this area, seems to have some attachment, however tangential, to the explosion, the destruction of the Twin Towers, the loss of life, someone missing. We have a report on that very dynamic tonight from NBC News correspondent Rahima Ellis.
It is a horror we now all share. In the days that followed, our lives have become strangely connected by the acts of terror at the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. People like Monica O'Leary are connected to fate and timing that will live with them forever. On Monday, she lost her job in the Trade Center. On Tuesday, she lost her boyfriend and former co-workers.
On Monday afternoon, I found out I was laid off. And I kissed all of my colleagues goodbye. And now I'm thankful that I had a chance, that opportunity to kiss each one of them and tell each one of them how much they meant to me. They were my best friends, and they were my mentors.
In a park a mile away from Ground Zero, shocked New Yorkers wrote messages to missing friends and loved ones, expressing emotion that right now still has nowhere to go.
Everybody in the city knows somebody who works, or a friend of someone who works there. And we all hold our breath and wait and pray.
I'd spoken with my mother, and one of her best friend's daughter worked in the World Trade Center. She's 27 years old, 7 months pregnant. Her and her husband worked on the 91st floor, and they haven't heard anything from her.
They're holding their breath in England, too. Father David Smith watched the Trade Center crumble on TV and was jolted into the realization his cousin might have been inside.
So I emailed him, his brother, and some other friends of mine in the States, just to ask if they were all right. And about 11:30, I think it was, that same evening, his brother just contacted me with a little email. Richard missing. He was on floor 101. Please pray for him.
And in New York's bars and cafes, where news of the terror attacks has replaced sports on the TV screens, optimism about the missing is starting to fade.
And now today I opened up the Daily News and I saw my friend's father there, so
in the Daily News as under the missing and dead.
And that's the way the story goes today in New York. And New Yorkers are also reaching out to someone, anyone who might have been through anything remotely close to this. There aren't that many in the United States. One whose name occurred to us today, Frank Keating, the governor of Oklahoma, who of course had to preside over so much tragedy. And tonight, I asked him about his thoughts since learning of the World Trade Center and Pentagon terrorist attacks.
There are just mixed emotions: horror, rage, anger, puzzlement, bereavement, fear, everything, every conceivable emotion you can have, you have. The titanic nature of this, the unspeakable evil of this, it is indescribable and incomprehensible.
Does it make you cringe when you learn that there are areas where the terrorists win, meaning the fact that the U.S. Capitol was evacuated this many days after the explosion because of a jittery atmosphere in the Capitol, the fact that there's still no commercial airline traffic tonight out of New York, and the fact that as many as 7 people might have been up to something yet again?
But that's precisely what they want. They want a temporary victory. They know they can't get a permanent victory. They can get a psychological nudge. They can get an agony nudge, but they can't really win. What the president is doing, and I think the national security team are doing very well, what the people on the ground are doing extraordinarily well, are really 3 things. First, rescue and recovery. The most important thing now is to find people who are living, extract the dead, heal us as a country. But secondly, to identify those responsible, whether it's tomorrow or next week, someday we'll get them, just like we did those who were responsible for Oklahoma City. And then thirdly, something we didn't have to do here, and that is ask ourselves, how in the world could people like this get into the country? Is there a breakdown in the visa system? Is there a breakdown at the border? How come if everybody goes through immigration and customs, these kinds of individuals with this kind of black plan could actually get in here and remain here? How many people heard but didn't say anything about it? That's the unanswered question, and obviously something we need to do over the course of the next several weeks.
Remind me, how many days was it the longest surviving person pulled from the rubble in Oklahoma City?
Well, unfortunately, we didn't have anybody. The first day was the last person alive who came out. It was a calamitous collapse, just like the 2 towers were. And even though we hoped, we never found anybody. The first came out the first day. But I'm so excited to know that there are people, particularly these firefighters who went in there right at the end, who have been found. And let me say something, Brian. The New York Fire Department and the police department were here in Oklahoma City. Ray Downey, my very dear friend who was killed, the chief and really in charge of that whole operation, that is a first-rate department, excellent professionals, and it makes all of us grieve the more because they are such wonderful human beings. And of course, that's not even including all the wonderful people who are lost in this tragedy. Senseless, unspeakable horror. And obviously, eventually, we're going to get them and make sure it never happens again.
What can the New York area, what can the Washington area, and for that matter, since this was a national tragedy, what can the people of the U.S. expect? What is the kind of emotional prediction that you have based on experience of the days to come?
Well, the worst really is yet to come. The what-ifs, the how-comes, the finger-pointing, the bereavement, the utterly vacant, completely dry, wind-sucked feel that most people will have after a week or 10 days when the adrenaline runs out. That's where religious counseling and that's where professional counseling comes in. That's so very important that that be organized, and FEMA does a great job of coordinating all those particular services. And obviously, what we can do as Americans is to pray. The president's asked for a day of mourning tomorrow. We had one here. What we can do is give blood when it's needed, and obviously provide every resource that our friends and fellow countrymen in New York and Washington need. But obviously, the most important thing is to determine how in the world this could happen. These numbers of people, post-mortem this, murder-boarded, if you will, and make sure it never happens again.
And I guess to realize that you never really get over it, too.
No, you'll never get over it. People will remember it forever. That empty chair at the dining room table will never be filled. But that's where all of us come in. I was so impressed with the the New York family, the stereotype of New York is lost forever. I mean, New Yorkers are warm and wonderful people, people sharing and caring for one another. That's America at its very best, and all of us Okies, us Midwesterners, we're very proud of our fellow countrymen in New York.
Oklahoma Governor Frank Keating. And when people in this country learned, as many did, that Russian President Vladimir Putin had gone on national television in his country to speak in such great sympathy for the Americans and the attack they had undergone, it was clear to Americans that this story had hit home around the world. More on worldwide reaction and response tonight from NBC News correspondent Dana Lewis.
Outside Buckingham Palace, a break with one of England's oldest traditions. Today, for the first time, the American anthem played during the changing of the guard to honor those who died in the attack on the U.S. British and American citizens, allies in the past, now standing shoulder to shoulder in another time of trouble.
Unbelievably comforting to Americans to hear the wonderful sympathy that has been expressed by the English people.
2 minutes of silence observed by the British Guard and by people struggling to comprehend the human toll.
Well, it's just hard to know that 15,000 families or more than that are just destroyed for no reason. I mean, it's just real hard.
Europe is asking, could it be next? Britain beefing up security, 1,000 extra police on patrol. Paris, a sea of candles. In cathedrals, deep sympathy for America. Germany came to a stop. Factories closed. School children carried messages of support. Russia, the Kremlin clock tower signaled a minute of silence. State TV stopped broadcasting. Hundreds placed flowers outside the U.S. Embassy. I want to say that America is our friend, he says. Even in the Middle East, where some Palestinians first danced in joy when America was attacked, later their leader Yasser Arafat donates blood and expresses shock. In airports across the world, stranded Americans desperate to go home. Those who can't go home cling to symbols, the American flag. The Roosevelt statue in London has become a makeshift memorial. Among those who signed a book of condolences at the American Embassy today, former British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher.
We stand with them for freedom, for rule of law, for democracy.
Today, the British government announced roughly 500 British citizens were lost in the attack on the World Trade Center. Tomorrow, here at St. Paul's Cathedral, the Queen will be part of a special memorial service to honor British and American victims of Tuesday's terror. Dana Lewis, NBC News, London.
Then there are the flags. Yes, they are popping up all over the United States. Yes, there is an enormous flag in the center span of the George Washington Bridge between New York and New Jersey. But one flag was noticeable when it went up yesterday above the wreckage, an impromptu raising of the American flag by some firefighters that reminded a whole lot of people of a moment in time that was captured by Newswire photographer Joe Rosenthal so many years ago, the top of Mount Suribachi on the hard-fought island of Iwo Jima. After so many Marines had lost their lives, it was a big moment for the United States, just as for those firefighters in New York yesterday, a big moment for them. The city that was the World Trade Center, home by date of 50,000 people. Well, a lot of those people live in the outlying suburban communities around New York City. They travel into the big city by day and back out to the bedroom communities by night. The problem is it's those bedroom communities that now are empty, that have so many people that never came home after the blast. And look at that part of this story tonight from Dateline NBC correspondent John Hockenberry.
They called them the windows on the world. And once upon a time, on a clear day, they contained a view of 4 states, hundreds of towns and villages from which thousands each day made their way to the World Trade Center to work. Places with names like Summit, Woodcliff, Pleasantville, Garden City, Edgewater, New Hope. Places with green lawns and brick chimneys, two-car garages, and the promise each day of escape from the big city. Homes untouched by the city's chaos, communities sustained by the city's wealth. In each of these places, nothing has changed, and everything has changed. Every one of these towns and villages has a story of loss and waiting. From each of these places, dozens, perhaps in some cases hundreds of people left for work on Tuesday morning. In so many communities, they are still waiting for mommies, daddies, loved ones to come home. The signs are everywhere. Cars parked and abandoned, commuter platforms suspiciously uncrowded, appointments missed, garments unclaimed. In Greenwich, the commute to downtown Manhattan is about 44 minutes. This week, each moment has been an eternity. Greenwich wife and mother Sophie Pelletier's husband Mike left at his normal time on Tuesday morning for work on the 105th floor of Tower 1. Sophie was taking their daughter out of the car seat when the phone rang.
I picked up and he was just panicked on the phone, telling me that the building had just been hit by a plane and that they were looking for a way out, but they didn't know how to get out, and just telling me that he loved me. And I know my husband, he wasn't calling to worry me. He was calling me because he thought it may be the last time he spoke to me.
Sophie tried to get help, calling 911. She reached a number in Connecticut. Her efforts were futile. Meanwhile, the Pelletier's friend Randy Christ had managed to reach Mike after trying desperately for half an hour. They spoke for 5 minutes.
I said, "What are you doing right now?" And he said, "I'm leaning out of the window. I'm trying to get air."
The phone went dead. About 30 minutes later, the tower collapsed. Sophie has had no further news from any source of Mike's fate.
I just want to have him home. He was my life, my soulmate, the father of my children, my husband. You know, I feel like I can't live without him, but I have to. If anyone has seen Mike or heard from him or heard that someone saw him, if you could please call us at home at 203-861-7811.
This community has mobilized itself for grief and the realization that it has become a city of orphaned children, widowed wives, and unanswered questions.
As an example, we have one family whose father was a Little League coach. And I have parents calling from his team and saying, what am I going to tell these children about where their coach is?
Here at the hairdressers, blanks instead of appointments, and fear of thinking too hard about the names.
Well, we had one lady whose husband worked in the building, and she spent most of the time here either on her telephone to people, or we had a couple of people run in and wanted to try and contact people who are in the city.
Escape to the suburbs. The idea was once tantalizing to each of the people who decided to settle here in Greenwich, Connecticut, and the other communities that were once within view of the Twin Towers. Now around here, escape is all about life and death.
And consider this from the Associated Press tonight. It reads, as experts prepare to identify what could be thousands of bodies from the rubble in the World Trade Center, relatives of the missing are sadly filling out a 7-page form that asks for heartbreaking personal details. What size was the person's wedding ring? What was the inscription? Does he have a pacemaker, a lodged bullet, shrapnel? Does she have artificial fingernails? What color did she paint her toenails? All of this information is needed, along with pictures, any memories, distinguishing marks, anything that could help in the search for what are believed to be 4,700 people who were in the World Trade Center and around those two twin towers at the moment of the first blast, and then the second, and then the building collapse that brought down those two towering landmarks. We're going to close with some images put together by our videotape editor, Barry Silverman. Forrest Sawyer will take over, continuing NBC News coverage on MSNBC. Don't forget the very latest live tomorrow morning on Today. And, of course, your late local news on your NBC television station. For now, I'm Brian Williams, NBC News.
It's me. I just wanted to let you know I love you, and I'm stuck in this building in New York.
Even as we continue to hold out hope that more of these brave Americans will be found alive, It is my duty as Attorney General to begin to process the provision of relief to the families of public safety officers who sacrificed so that others might survive the attacks of September the 11th.
The Pentagon now says there are 190 people confirmed dead. Fire officials have changed the language. They were using search and rescue. They are now saying it's a search and recovery operation because they do not believe there is anyone alive inside that wreckage.
President Bush today visited a hospital here in Washington, and 11 victims of the Pentagon bombing. He visited with them, and he visited with their families. He also visited with the doctors and staff there, thanking them all. Earlier today in the Oval Office here in the White House, the president put in a phone call to New York City, to Governor George Pataki, Mayor Rudolph Giuliani, and the president said he is going to travel to New York tomorrow to see the devastation firsthand and talk about what the federal government will be able to do there.
It's one of the worst things I've ever seen in my life. But we're all brothers. We all got to stick together. I wear my bandana because it represents the country of freedom.
You're dealing with a very, very skilled, knowledgeable, thinking enemy. And we just have to think better than them, think faster than them, and be cleverer than them in order to respond in a sensible way with all of the weapons at our disposal. And one of those weapons is military force used in an appropriate way.
This was an enormous attack against the people of the United States, and I would say all the people of the world who love and honor civilization and humanity. And we must act in concert and together to give the president what the president needs and requires in order to get this done.
He's alive! He's alive!
The car was dug up that was buried since Tuesday morning. The building had collapsed on top of the car, and the 5 people were trapped in the car since Tuesday morning. And they finally dug the car out, and when they opened the door, 2 of them literally got out and walked right out of the car.
My husband was on the 102 floor. He worked with the company Marsh McLean.
Well, this is my girlfriend's husband of 2.5 months ago they were married.
He was on the 105th floor. He worked for Cantor and Fitzgerald.
We look around all the hospital, all shelters, every place that they send us.
Laura Marchese. She works for Alliance Consulting Corp, World Trade Center 1.
My uncle, we heard from him 27th floor in Tower 1. He was waiting with his friend, a quadriplegic. He wouldn't leave unless he could help him get down.
This is a terrible moment. But this country will not relent until we have saved ourselves and others from the terrible tragedy that came upon America.
The building where a bomb went off, we don't know, but there's lots of smoke, and we just wanted you to know that I love you always.
My brother was an all-American boy from the get-go.
This country will not relent until we have saved ourselves and others from the terrible tragedy.
Well, it is 2 a.m. on the East Coast, and it has been raining.
around New York City. That is why you see that strange distortion on our camera lens. It is shooting through the raindrops. That is not a good sign. It's been quite a terrible thunderstorm, but still the work goes on in the face of this and all of the other problems as they try desperately and with increasingly little hope to try to find survivors there in the collapse of the World Trade Center towers. Here is the latest that we are following for you. $40 billion is earmarked by the United States government for the anti-terrorism program. That is in security, and that is in moving forward to attack the terrorists. Arrests have been made, or at least one arrest has been made at JFK. One person picked up, arrested, 5 people detained there. 5 people have been detained at LaGuardia. You can believe that security at these and other airports is at the highest of all alerts. A report from the Boston Herald, will be hearing more about this. A report saying that the attacks on the World Trade Center towers and the Pentagon planned for over 5 years. And Logan Airport in Boston was cased for at least 6 months. And President Bush, we have been hearing his moving comments about all of this today, plans to visit New York City tomorrow. He has already visited the Pentagon, and he has declared Friday a national day of mourning and asking as many Americans as can to fly American flags. One bit of good news, the black box was recovered in Pennsylvania. That, of course, the box that would indicate what was going on inside the plane. And Osama bin Laden, said to be on the move, said to have left the home where he has stayed for a number of times, said to have left that shortly after the attacks on the World Trade Center towers and the Pentagon, and it is not at all clear where Osama bin Laden is now, although it is believed that he is somewhere inside Afghanistan. Now, I told you that a front page story in this morning's Boston Globe, I said the Herald, I meant to say the Globe, says investigators have evidence that the plannings of the suicide hijackings of those 4 airlines began at least 5 years ago. The article reports that the men who commandeered 2 Boston flights began casing Logan at least 6 months ago. Joining us now on the phone is Boston Globe reporter Kevin Cullen, who has been covering the investigation. And walk me through this, Kevin. Give me a sense of what it is that you're uncovering.
Well, myself and a colleague, Shelley Murphy, were able to piece together some things, mostly from investigators, also from making some phone calls. It seems that whoever put this group up to it, whoever organized this, had a long-range plan, what the Russians used to call a 5-year plan. And what it began with was training a number of people so that they would be able to take control of a commercial jet and do what we saw, what happened on Tuesday morning at the Trade Center and also at the Pentagon. What happened is it seems as though they found out that in Florida there are about 80 training schools, flight schools, and it's pretty easy to get in there, and most of the people there are foreigners. Excuse me. What they found out is if you have the money, you can get into the classes. And so obviously they were very well bankrolled. These are not cheap classes. Some of them go as much as $30,000, $40,000 for flight simulating. So what they did is they sent people over and gradually built up a network of people that were able to mount this sort of size of a conspiracy, because as we know, there were 4 flights. There may have been more that they wanted to get on. And there were more than one pilot on all of these, in all of these flights that were hijacked. There wasn't one. They were obviously banking that maybe there would have been a struggle and one of the trained pilots would not be able to take control. There was more than one pilot, one trained pilot, on all of the hijacked jets.
Now, you say whoever was behind this, as you know, the United States government has said that they definitively point the finger at Osama bin Laden. And it does appear that what you're describing, which is people who go into a country and stay in that country for a very long time, almost like sleeper agents, is a kind of fingerprint for Osama's past.
Certainly that's where the people in Washington are pointing, although it's still unclear whether a number of these people were Sunni Muslims or Shia Muslims. If in fact they were Sunni Muslims, then that would make sense that they were lined up with Mr. bin Laden. If in fact they are Shia Muslims, these are 2 groups that generally do not mix. So that is something that investigators are still trying to track down. The other thing we found out...
Let me just be clear, because a lot of people might not know quite what you mean. These are 2 different sects of Muslims. Osama bin Laden, being a Saudi, would be Sunni Muslim, and Shiite Muslims would be, for instance, Iranians.
Correct. And it's unclear. There's clearly there's an ethnic mix here from different Arabian groups here, and it's still unclear the number of nationals or the different countries that the people involved here came from. And talking to an investigator today, they've got one guy with a Saudi passport who had an Egyptian driver's license who may have been from the United Arab Emirates. So this is what they're up against, trying to piece this together.
Now, I've read some reporting that says that some of these people who were getting their flight training in Florida had used Saudi passports and had indicated that they were associated with Saudi Airlines, and that therefore they would not have received the kind of scrutiny that others would, because the Saudis, of course, are allies of the United States.
Exactly. We found that was a strong pattern in all of this. There are a number of it. At least half of the hijackers in the Boston cases either had Saudi passports or claimed the sponsorship or employment of Saudi Arabian Airlines. And I talked to a number of flight instructors in Florida today, and they said the way it works down there is if you apply for membership in these flight classes and say you're from Saudi Arabia, they just ship over an exemption paper, which the schools can issue directly to students. The students then take it to the U.S. Embassy or a U.S. consulate somewhere in Saudi Arabia, and it basically is rubber stamped. Now, we talked to the State Department tonight, and they denied that. They said that there's much more scrutiny than that would suggest. But everyone, I talked to several, I think I talked to 4 people who are either involved in training as flight instructors or involved in the aviation industry in Florida, and they all had a very same take on it, is that if you come from Saudi Arabia, either if they sponsor you or you have a Saudi passport, you basically get into the United States, no questions asked.
I'll tell you, Kevin, if you listen to your reporting and the other reporting that we have seen, if we talk about people who are on the ground for 5 years living normal lives, who have been, one presumes, cut out from the magnitude of the mission so that they effectively wouldn't know everything that was going on until a larger operative came into town to turn them on. If you talk about passports, if you talk about Saudi Airlines identifications, ramp passes such as the one that was used at Logan Airport, this really is a sophisticated and expensive operation.
It's extraordinarily sophisticated and it's extraordinarily expensive, which raises the question, I think, as you raised, Forrest, who sponsors these guys? Where do they come from? They should not have that kind of money to throw around. One of the most extraordinary things about this is that we believe, we are led to believe that these are devout, fundamentalist Muslims who are making a sacrifice here, who are killing the infidels. And yet I talk to people in Florida, and several of my colleagues talk to people in Florida who report that these men were drinking in bar rooms, which if they did this in their host countries, such as Saudi Arabia, they would be subject to execution. So there's a very, very strange picture drawing here. And one of it involves the money that is thrown around. And that is something that I think, obviously, our newspaper, I know NBC has been all over that angle the past 24 hours and did some great reporting on some of the suspects and some of their criminal backgrounds and how they got into the United States. I think we're all going to be looking there the next few days. Where did they get the money? How did they have the ability to get to these training schools, pay for these, given that their lifestyle suggests that they had very, not menial jobs, but certainly not the kind of jobs that you could throw out $30,000 or $40,000 to take a flight simulator course somewhere in Florida.
To underscore your point, you're saying basically that if they were very conservative Muslims, the Muslim religion prohibits drinking alcohol, and so therefore if you were to see them drinking alcohol, there'd be something quite wrong with that.
Absolutely, and the witness accounts was not describing a moderate intake of alcohol, but a rather extraordinary intake of alcohol and sort of an extraordinary display of money.
We've been seeing a lot of reporting that suggests that the ground support they had at Logan Airport was extensive, and that there may be others who have pilots' licenses who are kicking around the United States now. Have you found anything like that?
Well, we're getting conflicting messages on that from the investigators. Some say that, they did have support on the ground. Others said they didn't even need it, that the security was such that you know, what they used to take control of the flights out of Logan were things that they could smuggle on board that got through the security. One thing we're really finding is that it doesn't even matter what the equipment at the check-in counters is like. It's the people who man them, and we're talking about folks who are paid more or less minimum wage, high turnover, very poor training. So it's unclear whether they brought the weapons on or had secreted weapons on. But one thing is clear about Logan and every other airport is that the ground staff, people that either cater planes, people that clean planes, are not vetted. They are not people whose backgrounds are checked. So given what we know about this group, that they may have spent as much as 5 years or more planning this conspiracy, it's not much of a leap to suggest that they invested some money and some time in getting people on the ground and access to tarmacs, not just at Logan, but probably at Dulles also.
I'm curious about your take on this. Here is what we know. There were 2 teams of 5. There were 2 teams of 4 that were on board the airplanes. That makes a total of 18. The LA Times this morning was reporting that there were a total of 50 people believed to have been involved in all of this, and now that's been knocked down a bit today, and so now it's a bit more confused about the total numbers of people who might have been involved. Have you heard anything about that at all?
Well, people we talked, the 50 number might be arbitrary. I don't think the Times was that far off, and they clearly got it from people in very senior positions at Justice. The two reporters who wrote that have very good contacts in Justice. There's no doubt from the people we've talked to doing the Boston investigation, that angle, is that they believe that the conspirators, that the people that arrived and basically went off to their deaths as part of this conspiracy did not do it alone. That the logistics involved, they needed support here. They stayed at hotels in the area, but they had people, they had supporters in the area. And the reality, and I think it's very disturbing to people to accept this, is that there are a number of people in pockets of Boston, in pockets of I'm sure of New York, in pockets of any giant urban area in America who silently or maybe openly cheered what happened on Tuesday morning. And so right now part of the investigation is to identify the people who on the ground added or provided the logistics that the conspirators who boarded the planes needed to make this happen.
That's true, and there's another point. If this were to follow Osama's pattern in previous attacks, for instance, the embassy attacks in Africa, these sleepers would have had to been turned on by operatives who were operating at a higher level, who came in and said, okay, here is what you actually should do. Here are your marching orders. So while there may have been logistical support, there have to be people that were in touch with them that were operating at a higher level, and they presumably were in the United States as well.
Absolutely. I talked to somebody, involved in the investigation today who said if in fact it's bin Laden, and he wasn't saying it absolutely was, if in fact it was bin Laden, typically the way it would be is that these guys that got on the planes had been trained over a period of time and then awaited orders. And somebody arrived here from a very high level and said, it's time to go. And yet below that other level, there were flunkies. There were people who were doing minor things for them, which is whether checking out surveillance or security at the airport or noting what would be the flights. We don't know. Why did they choose United? Why did they choose American? There are any number of flights that they could have chosen. It's pretty obvious that they chose from an East Coast location transcontinental flights, which would have ensured full tanks of fuel, which would have added to the carnage, and which clearly we saw, at least in the case of the World Trade Center crashes, added to the collapse of those buildings. So it's all those things that added up. These folks were down in Florida doing their training. Somebody was up here doing that kind of surveillance for them, saying, well, if you get on a flight at 7:59 a.m. in Boston, it goes to Los Angeles and has a full tank of fuel.
I think I just heard you say that an investigator told you that if it were Osama bin Laden. Now, we've got the administration saying that they believe definitively that it is. Are you saying the investigators are not so certain?
I'm saying that who I talked to at this level are focused much more. It's much more micro. They are looking at these are folks who are knocking on doors, rustling suspects, checking out, credit card receipts. These are guys that are doing the day-to-day shoe leather stuff. I don't have that kind of source at the Justice Department that's pulling it all together and taking CIA intercepts. I'm talking to folks who are really more at ground level.
I'll tell you something. The kind of organization that you're describing, one which seems to have its tentacles into all areas of American life, that has a tremendous support system, as well as these people who are doing the training, as well as the people who are actually running them. That fact is something that strikes a lot of fear, a lot of concern in the Arab community that is living here peacefully, innocently, and as good citizens in the United States, that there might be a witch hunt and that they might be dragged through all of this as people try to uproot this organization.
I think that's absolutely true, and it's actually horribly unfair. I was talking to a state trooper here today who said to me, he said, it's not fair, it's not right, but right now every Muslim American is suspect. And that's just the way it is, and it's outrageous. But, I think the difference is, I guess, people have made comparisons to Pearl Harbor and the American reaction after that, and I think that reaction was sort of lock them up and we'll deal with this when the war is over. Obviously that's not going to happen in 2001 America, but there is that, there have been cases here. There was just yesterday here in Boston, they surrounded a hotel, and I'm telling you, it was an extraordinary swoop. And I think there were about 300 law enforcement officers involved, and it turned out to be a family, or at least 3 people of Arabic descent, who were renting a car, and who had the misfortune of having the same last name as one of the hijackers. And somebody noticed that, or at least noticed that they were Arab, and called the police or called the FBI, and within a half hour the place was surrounded. These people were taken out in a very high security situation, and eventually they were released. And that is what is, right now, anybody is suspect if in fact they have the misfortune, or just not the misfortune, that's a pejorative. What I'm saying is anybody of an Arabic background, name whatever you want to call it, is suspect, and it's not fair, it's not right, but as this cop said to me today, it's just the way it is.
Well, it's a bit of hysteria, because unless I am missing something, I haven't heard of a single Arab American who is involved in this. These are all people who were here under visas. Is that not right?
That's true. From my understanding, because I've been asking about, is anybody a naturalized citizen, and nobody yet has been, but it really is unfortunate, and I think it's going to be a measure. That there has been violence directed at Arab Americans, and I'm sure they must be terrified, thinking that some moron, some ignorant person is going to harm, if not kill one. And the police, frankly, I know the Boston police. I was talking to Superintendent Jim Hussey, who's in charge of the uniform branch of Boston. They are really guarding against that. They're terrified at the prospect of some poor, unsuspecting Arabic cab driver being dragged out and beaten to death. It could happen. That said, I must say that one thing that you've seen on television, and all of the spiritual events that have been held, has sort of been this ecumenical response that this cannot happen. That Americans should be judged by the way they react to this situation, and singling out anybody of the Muslim faith for intolerance, hatred, or violence as a result of this is just basically lowering yourself to the level of the people that perpetrated the atrocity in the first place.
Good point, Kevin. Let us hope that we remember what the nation stands for as we move through all this. Kevin Cullen is a reporter with the Boston Globe, and his article, along with Shelley Murphy, is about the extent of the organization, how long it's been here, and how thoroughly they worked to pull this off. Kevin, thanks so much for talking to us.
Thank you, Forrest. Good night.
Good night. Police at New York's John F. Kennedy Airport arrested or detained as many as 8 men. This on Thursday at 2 of the major airports, including one man who apparently tried to board an American Airlines flight to California. Remember, all those 4 planes came from this area and headed toward California, and he was using, it is said, a false pilot's ID. We have more from WNBC's Scott Weinberger.
It all began at this United Airlines terminal, Port Authority sources tell News Channel 4, just after 5:30 this evening. Here's what we know so far. While already on board and awaiting unloading by other passengers, 3 of the suspects are confronted by the crew. And it's not clear why the crew became suspicious, but when escorted off the plane, one claimed to be a pilot and displayed a pilot's license. Sources confirmed that that license was, quote, bogus. The United Terminal went into total lockdown, and Port Authority police located and arrested the other 4 suspects within the terminal. At the same time, up at LaGuardia Airport, another man is placed under arrest. And sources confirmed to News Channel 4 that 4 of the suspects under arrest tonight were holding tickets on a United Airlines flight bound for Los Angeles, just as 2 hijacked planes slammed into the World Trade Towers. News Channel 4 reported yesterday that those men fled the airport after being confronted by security officers. Investigative sources tell News Channel 4 tonight they do believe all 8 suspects, all who appear Middle Eastern, are connected to the deadly terrorist attack on Tuesday.
All right now, all 3 major New York airports, that's John F. Kennedy Airport, LaGuardia, and Newark, are closed while the investigation into all of this still goes on. Now, earlier tonight, Brian Williams talked with Jim Olson. He's a passenger who was on that American Airlines jetliner where police, as you heard, detained 3 potential suspects. Brian asked him to pass along his story.
It starts with trying to get home to Los Angeles after being in New York for at least 2 weeks about now.
And you're trying to get on a commercial flight, and what happens?
I was on American's Flight 133 bound for LA, which is supposed to be the first American flight to leave JFK at 4 o'clock this afternoon. We sat on the tarmac for about 3 hours to 4 hours. They finally cleared us to leave the gate. And next thing we know, there were at least probably half a dozen to a dozen armed SWAT team gunmen that stormed through the back of the plane. They had us put our heads into crash position, and they dragged out at least 1 potential terrorist, and we think as many as 3.
Wow. Now, you're sitting there with a, partial plane load, full plane load worth of passengers waiting to go to Los Angeles. And given the climate right now, actually, you're on the ground in a city where the World Trade Center is gone. That must have scared the hell out of everybody.
It was surreal. I mean, it really brought terrorism within arm's reach. I mean, you see these scenes on TV, but it's a whole different experience when it's only a heartbeat away. And everyone was very calm before it happened. Everyone was actually looking forward to getting home, and it really changed the whole equilibrium of the plane once this all happened.
I bet it did. How much were you told in advance about the delay, and how much were you ever told about what you had just witnessed?
It all happened very fast. The only hint that actually we didn't think anything was going to happen. When they told us we were going to push back from the gate, they gave us a heads up that there might be some police cars that might escort us to the end of the runway for security reasons, which no one really, actually everyone thought that was actually pretty exciting. But then obviously it was a smokescreen for the raid.
So they came in and plucked from your midst, how many individuals did you say?
Well, I saw at least 1, but then actually it was hard to sort of see because we were all sort of in crash position, so you sort of saw things in shadows sort of out of the corner of your eye. But in talking to some folks that were actually sitting right next to the passengers that were extracted, it turns out, according to them, that there were 2 women and one gentleman that were.
Had you seen any words exchanged prior to this with those passengers and members of the flight crew?
Not at all. I was actually sitting in the back of the plane, about 3 rows from the very back, and it was just, we don't even really know exactly which seats those passengers were in. They were in the front end of the coach section of the plane.
Because we have learned since that a total of 8 people were either arrested or detained. All of them seem to have a common thread, impersonating airline employees, telling one story only for officials to learn that the truth was something else. And the wildest theory of the afternoon was that perhaps another set of potential hijackers was going to try the same thing with a commercial airline. Final question to you is, what was security like when you finally got to JFK and thought you were going to take a commercial flight? Start at the curb when you arrive at the airport. What was different than flying normally?
Well, there was definitely no curbside check-in, and everything actually seemed very calm and process-oriented checking in. and it was actually pretty streamlined, actually getting your ticket. Where I got a little bit nervous was actually at the X-ray and security gateway. They certainly were wanding us and doing some extra sort of metal detection, but there was certainly, at least from my individual experience, there wasn't any sort of extra digging through bags, and it seemed very hurried, like some people were actually even being able to sort of slip through without being wanded. So then I compared notes with some other folks that were sitting next to me on the flight, and they also sort of felt that security wasn't as tight as we necessarily expected.
And that is Jim Olson, who was a passenger on that American Airlines flight, talking to Brian Williams about the events in which 3 people were actually taken off the plane. Now, let's remember what the investigation, and this is the largest criminal investigation in the history of the United States, what the investigation is about now. Trying to get a good, clear picture of the suspects and, critically, trying to locate the people who helped them on the ground. Here is NBC's Pete Williams.
New details about how the hijackers spread out to take over the 4 planes that crashed Tuesday. 5 each, the FBI says, on the 2 planes that left Boston and flew into the World Trade Center towers. And 4 on each of the other 2, the one from Washington Dulles that crashed into the Pentagon and the plane that left Newark and crash-landed in Pennsylvania. 18 hijackers in all. The Justice Department plans to release the names of all 18, along with pictures of those for which the FBI can find confirmed photographs. Federal officials tell NBC News they now believe the suicide flights were at least 2 years in the planning. A picture emerging as tips come flooding in.
The FBI's leads hotline has received 2,055 phone calls. Some of these leads have been helpful to the investigation. The website, which was opened virtually immediately after the crisis, has received more than 22,700 suggested tips.
Federal agents are now investigating whether some of the hijackers got jet training at this flight school in Minneapolis. Government officials tell NBC News that just last month, a man of Middle Eastern descent was detained there on immigration charges after instructors at the school became suspicious when the man offered a large sum of cash in return for training in the school's jet flight simulator. Agents also rushed to a flight school in western Michigan to see whether any of the hijackers might have trained there. In Boston, investigators find an airport employee tarmac pass in that car driven by 2 of the suspected hijackers, generating new questions for the FBI about whether the hijackers had any inside help. The FBI's new director says finding associates of the hijackers is a top priority for federal agents.
They are, where necessary, obtaining search warrants, obtaining grand jury subpoenas, and whatever is necessary to obtain the evidence to identify more particularly identify the particular hijackers and anyone associated with them.
A sign that the investigation is truly worldwide, as German authorities, acting on a tip from the FBI, detain an American at the Hamburg airport for questioning. U.S. officials tell NBC News the man, originally from Yemen, carried an airline ticket for destinations in cities throughout Europe.
There are some people who have been conducting the investigation who believe that at least part of this operation may have actually begun in Hamburg and then spread here to the United States, but that is not clear at this point. I want to talk to former CIA officer Antonio Mendez. Now, he's author of The Master of Disguise, My Secret Life in the CIA, and his exploits with the agency include helping 6 Americans escape from Iran, where they were trapped in the Canadian embassy during the hostage crisis in 1980. We all remember that. Joins us now from our Washington bureau. Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
Well, you were actually a master of disguise with the CIA. You were helping coming up with all sorts of identifications for people. Is that right?
That's correct, yeah.
So help me understand this. We've been hearing about these guys who have Saudi passports, who have identifications associating them with the Saudi airlines, who have ramp access passes, who have passes identifying them as pilots and so on that they just tried to pull on airlines just today. How hard is it to have those kinds of things in your possession?
Well, if you're a professional outfit like this one seems to be, that's all part of doing business. And you know, when we started tracking terrorists as early as 1972, after the Munich Olympic affair, we started finding all sorts of shops where they could produce or procure this kind of thing, and a lot of it was very sophisticated.
Well, you've got a picture. You've seen these kinds of organizations before. As you look through what you've been hearing about this group, how do you rank them? What do you think about what they're doing?
Well, I would say that we've reached a new order of magnitude in terms of sophistication. what I'm hearing would rank up there with major intelligence services that are participated on both sides of the Cold War. We used to use intelligence services as the high watermark for terrorist operations, and they rarely met that kind of test. It seems like this one is going to meet that test.
Do you believe something this sophisticated could be run without the assistance of some nation?
Well, I think what you have here is a major coalition of activity. There'll probably be some state-sponsored activity as well as the cells that are operating independently. But what I think is most notable in this instance is the fact that there is no profile that we can see very readily. They seem to be in the shadows.
What do you mean, no profile? We don't know who they are?
That's right. I don't think we know this enemy. Bin Laden most likely is a major figure, but I don't think we know the full extent of the enemy. I think it's much bigger than what we had thought before.
Yeah, there seems to be some suggestion that it's not just bin Laden's organization that was involved. This is coming out of Hamburg, that it may be a number of extremist organizations that were cooperating, perhaps led by him. But that at least is what some people are now speculating. You concur with that?
I would think so, yeah.
As you look at this, and walk me through this a little bit, just give me a sense. It's, by the way, it's the bottom of the hour, so let me just pass that along to you. You were watching NBC and MSNBC. I'm Forrest Sawyer, and of course we are following the attack on the World Trade Center towers in the Pentagon, and we are doing that 24 hours a day. I'm talking with Antonio Mendez, a former CIA officer. Mr. Mendez, walk me through this. We've been hearing about these sleepers who were put into the ground possibly as long ago as 5 years, and then might have been waked up by some sort of operative. Is that standard procedure?
Well, I would say 5 years is a fair amount of time. The other report said something like 2 years, somewhere between 2 and 5. But certainly there's got to be a lot more infrastructure than meets the eye to do something this sophisticated. They built a lot of redundancy into it. Their timing was exquisite. Certainly there are other elements here that have not yet met scrutiny.
What kind of elements do you mean?
Well, what I mean is, we saw 4 airplanes, and I think the activity we're seeing today indicates that there were probably at least, a couple more, if not four more, that were in the mix. So the size of this activity is I think, yet to be divulged.
And would you, and I underscore that you are speculating here.
Yes.
But for say 18 people to be involved in these planes, and you believe that there may have been other efforts that were underway, does that require a much larger infrastructure underneath them?
Yeah, it requires a lot of planning, a lot of lead time, as I said, a lot of redundancy, because you don't pull it off with just 4 units. No one gets that kind of box score out of an operation this sophisticated. So I would estimate that there were other backup teams at least involved.
You know that the United States is pointing the finger now at Osama bin Laden, who is operating out of Afghanistan, and of course your career was a long and distinguished one with the CIA, and you have already heard this, you will likely hear it again. Osama was really trained by, in part, the Pakistan security forces with CIA backing. So is this, in a sense, the child of the CIA?
Well, I guess sometimes you have to consort with people who may be your enemies to get a job done, and that's what the war in Afghanistan was all about, is consorting with a mixture of people who both had the same goal in mind. But that doesn't mean that we raised them to be what they are.
No, certainly nobody thought that. But
yeah.
Was it a mistake to have left him in the fashion that the agency did?
To left him in the fashion that we did, I'm not sure that was really a mistake. I think that was just a matter of circumstances. But certainly in retrospect, one could say, we could have done something maybe different, and they wouldn't have turned on us, but I'm not sure that we could have prevented that in the first place.
Antonio Mendez is a former CIA officer, had a long career with the agency, and is author of Master of Disguise, My Secret Life from the CIA. Thanks for talking to us, especially at this late hour.
Oh, sure.
All right, let's move on now to Lower Manhattan. Jeannie Ohm is there following the rescue efforts, and it's been a nasty rain-filled evening, so it hasn't been very good. Jeannie, how are you?
That's right, Forrest. You know, the situation changed out here dramatically about an hour and a half ago. As predicted, the storm hit Manhattan, and it's been, you know, a heavy downpour on and off ever since. And in fact, you know, they've temporarily halted some of the rescue operations. We're told that they're only working in a small, limited area. Joining me right now is one of the volunteers, Greg D'Arienzo, a construction worker from New Jersey. He just came back from that area. Describe the conditions, what the rain has done to the conditions back there.
The rain has made everything very slick. Where you're working under like a big cloud of smoke almost, and with the lightning coming through the cloud, you hear things crashing around. It doesn't seem like a safe area.
Not only that, I imagine you have to be worried about your footing even more so.
Yeah, most of the material that you're stepping on is like metal beams and pieces of the building they get more slippery when they're wet, obviously, so it's a little bit more hazardous.
Okay, Greg, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you. We also want to point out, in one sense, the rain was good because it helped settle the dust, but the other concern, of course, is now the additional weight left from the water that collected on the ground. There's also something else going out here for us that we want to talk about, and that's there's been a lot of rumors, a lot of reports, and there's a lot of excitement at one point this evening. People were coming by, some of the volunteers coming off, saying that they had heard that there were 9 police officers trapped in the rubble. In fact, the wife of one of the officers was on the cell phone with him, but the fire department made it very clear, the New York City Fire Department, in fact, they went around to the different news organizations and they wanted to say, as much as they wanted to believe that was true, that was unfortunately a false report. So as things stand, there have been no new survivors, additional survivors brought out from the rubble ever since Wednesday. But of course, this is still, they're calling this still a rescue mission, so volunteers keep coming in. Even though right now things are on a very limited basis, they're still going back in, and they say they'll be out here as long as possible. One other thing we want to mention about this rain and why it is not helping in any way possible out here is because how they've been working is the volunteers have been sifting through, collecting the debris. Well, every 10 minutes or so, they stop. Silence is crucial here because they want to be able to listen. They're using dogs to see if they can hear any kind of tapping noise. So every time the storm passes through and there's more rain, that of course obviously hinders their ability to listen to see if there are survivors trapped beneath. Forrest?
Jeannie, these rumors do go around. There was a rumor earlier today, I know you know that 5 firefighters had been pulled out, and there were actually some firefighters who had simply slipped as they were going through the rescue operations, right?
You're right. Actually, yeah, there was a report that 5 firefighters were trapped in an SUV, and then they finally were brought out. What we heard for the most part that we can confirm was that, in fact, it was 3 firefighters who were out here in the rescue attempts, and they had gotten caught under the debris, and so that's what happened. You have to keep in mind there are thousands of people out here, so when they see some kind of flurry of activity, rumor gets spread or word gets spread, and unfortunately it's not accurate information. But from the best I can get, there is something else I wanted to tell you about. I'd say around 8 o'clock this evening, there was cheers that went up at one section, and there was reports that someone was trapped underneath. We were able to find out that that was a rescue worker that had lost his footing, and he was in fact pulled out. But again, it was not a survivor that was trapped from Tuesday's collapse.
Okay, thanks very much. Jeannie Ohm down there at the World Trade Center rescue operation going on now. You have to understand how very much people want someone to be found alive. There are all these thousands of people who are waiting for one bit of good news as these long days go on. People who are wondering what's happened to their loved ones and are going through an emotional nightmare, these families of those who are missing in the World Trade Center attack. Most people here in New York know somebody who has gotten lost. NBC's Edie Magnus has more.
The city is beginning to dig itself out, and a terrible truth is emerging too. The chances that loved ones missing since the attacks will be found are getting slimmer. It is one of many cruel twists to this tragedy that the chaos of those first 24 hours offered more hope that relatives, neighbors, or co-workers might be found. But now, it is day 3. What to do? Where to go? Jennifer Marvison finally left her home today. She's been too shocked and depressed until now, she tells us, to look for her fiancé, Keith Broomfeld.
This is the first I was able to face the world. I haven't been out. So this is the day that I'm going to find out, do or die, whatever it is I have to find out.
Jennifer's come to Bellevue Hospital to post a homemade flyer with Keith's picture on it here on what's called a wall of prayers. It has sprung up and, like a plant watered with tears, is growing steadily, covered with the pictures of missing people. Against a backdrop of spectacular blue skies and balmy weather, scores of people, emotional refugees, are wandering the city, looking, hoping, wondering what to do next about the ones they love but cannot find. Sean Fagan, 34, a trader on the 93rd floor of Tower 1, somewhere above where the first plane hit. His sister, Anne Marie, says there's been no word of him since that blast. She hit the streets this morning armed with 400 flyers and has been asking questions everywhere.
So you've been to the armory, the morgue?
No.
You have not gone to the morgue yet?
No.
Why not?
I'm hoping that my brother's not there.
What keeps you going?
Like, the alternative isn't, it's not an option that my brother's not okay, and until someone tells me he's not, then he is.
Countless others are feeling the same way, unable to let go of the possibility that their loved ones may be out there somewhere. So they're out too, posting pictures on phone booths, mailboxes, at the entrance of buildings. And after all, more survivors were rescued from the bloody rubble of the Twin Towers today. Maybe the answers are on this list. It's been pulled from the internet. Its accuracy is unknown. But it claims to contain information on the condition of many victims of the plane attacks.
Please don't give up hope.
This woman says she actually did find out her missing brother is alive by seeing his name on this list.
He's injured, but we found him.
Lorraine Browse has also been given a grain of hope. She's learned from the company on the 95th floor where her stepmother worked that someone had sighted her. Lorraine doesn't know exactly what that means. Could her stepmother still be alive, unconscious in a hospital? Or is it false information?
No, they don't have any specific information. All they had was her name on a list. It was very vague. It didn't really tell us much, but at least we know if she was alive, if she had survived, she has to be in the hospital someplace.
Lorraine was told to go to a downtown university to check a list of hospitalized victims.
I know it's going to take a miracle if she's alive. She was so high up in the building. We know she went in early that morning because she had gone to vote beforehand.
As she waits, she takes her place on a line among many others. The crowd, a sobering reminder of how widespread the suffering is. Finally, she gets a look.
Nothing.
No information?
They have partial hospital lists. She wasn't on any of the lists. There's nothing else we can do now.
Except wait and worry and pray that soon they will get an answer. Until then, they will have to keep looking here in this city of lost and found.
Do you still have hope that you'll find him?
Yeah, I hope that I find him. I have to find my brother either way. But we will find my brother one way or the other.
It's hard, I'll tell you. Jeannie Ohm and I were talking about some of the rumors that have been kicking around that sometimes lead nowhere. I should tell you that our reporting is far from perfect through all of this. The story constantly keeps changing. It does not only apply to what's happening down at the World Trade Center, it applies to anything else. For instance, there was word yesterday that the Taliban, the ruling party of Afghanistan, had placed Osama bin Laden under house arrest, and that has subsequently been denied by the Taliban, and now there is word that Osama has left the home where he was staying and gone into hiding somewhere. Now I read a report from London that an Afghan radio station says the Taliban are prepared to hand over Osama bin Laden to an Islamic court if the United States were able to prove his involvement in terrorist attacks in the United States. These kinds of reports we're likely to see for a while. I have no idea whether it's true or not. You can be sure, however, that the United States would not be satisfied with Osama being turned over to an Islamic court of the Taliban's choosing, so that's no solution at all. As you probably know by now, this is Friday morning, and today has been identified as a day of mourning and national remembrance and prayer here in the United States for the terrible events that began on September 11th. The President is going to be participating in a prayer service. This will be at the National Cathedral at noon today. And when he was talking about this Thursday, I expect we have all seen these pictures now, he was really very emotional, teared up at one point talking about what has happened here, and used some very strong language, saying this is the first war of the 21st century. That word war has powerful meaning when used by the President of the United States. And he said, make no mistake about it, this, the attack on terrorism, is going to become the focus of the Bush administration. NBC's Campbell Brown has more.
In the Oval Office, tears welling up in his eyes. The president today fully aware history will remember him by how he leads the country through this crisis.
I think about the families, the children. I'm a loving guy, and I'm also someone, however, who's got a job to do.
The president vows to, quote, whip terrorism, rallying the world to join the U.S. in this fight.
But now that war has been declared on us, we will lead the world to victory.
The gravity of the battle clearly weighing on the president as he and wife Laura visit a Washington hospital to spend time with the victims of the Pentagon attack to hear their horrifying stories.
They talked about escaping, going through fire, and crawling through debris.
At the White House, the president is in and out of meetings with lawmakers, key aides, and his national security team, continuing to reach out to leaders around the world, seeking military and economic support, assembling an international coalition to go to war. But in public, the president is focused on the immediate need here at home. On a conference call with New York Mayor Rudy Giuliani and Governor George Pataki, Bush says he will go to New York tomorrow to see for himself the destruction of the Twin Towers, to personally thank the men and women searching around the clock for the missing.
Well, I can't tell you how proud I am of the good citizens of your part of the world.
With Bush front and center, White House officials today revealed new information about what they say was a threat to Air Force One. One key aide says some advisors did question the wisdom of keeping the president moving between two Air Force bases far from Washington after the attacks, until they were told an anonymous caller phoned the Secret Service and warned, quote, Air Force One is next. The official says the caller knew code words relating to Air Force One's procedures and whereabouts. Today, the president defends his decision to stay away.
I know I took the appropriate actions as the commander-in-chief to handle the crisis.
Well, I suppose we're moving into day 4, and as you could see from President Bush's reaction, and the reaction of all of us, really, the kind of realization of what has happened is beginning to settle on our shoulders, much like the dust of the debris from the collapse of the Twin Towers. It just hangs on us, but finally we're beginning to accept the reality of all of this. It is not easy. It is painfully emotional for everyone, not only in this country, but around the world, because this attack on those towers and on the Pentagon is an attack on the global system that has been developed over this past decade, and therefore an attack on much of the world. And so much of the world has reached out to the United States. Here is Dana Lewis.
Outside Buckingham Palace, a break with one of England's oldest traditions. Today, for the first time, the American anthem played during the changing of the guard to honor those who died in the attack on the U.S. British and American citizens, allies in the past, now standing shoulder to shoulder in another time of trouble.
Unbelievably comforting to Americans to hear the wonderful sympathy that has been expressed by the English people.
2 minutes of silence observed by the British Guard and by people struggling to comprehend the human toll.
Well, it's just hard to know that
15,000 families or more than that are just destroyed for no reason. I mean, it's just real hard.
Europe is asking, could it be next? Britain beefing up security, 1,000 extra police on patrol. Paris, a sea of candles. In cathedrals, deep sympathy for America. Germany came to a stop. Factories closed. School children carried messages of support. Russia, the Kremlin clock tower signaled a minute of silence. State TV stopped broadcasting. Hundreds placed flowers outside the U.S. Embassy. I want to say that America is our friend, he says. Even in the Middle East, where some Palestinians first danced in joy when America was attacked, later their leader Yasser Arafat donates blood and expresses shock. In airports across the world, stranded Americans desperate to go home. Those who can't go home cling to symbols, the American flag. The Roosevelt statue in London has become a makeshift memorial. Among those who signed a book of condolences at the American Embassy today, former British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher.
We stand with them for freedom, for rule of law, for democracy.
Today, the British government announced roughly 500 British citizens were lost in the attack on the World Trade Center. Tomorrow, here at St. Paul's Cathedral, the Queen will be part of a special memorial service to honor British and American victims of Tuesday's terror. Dana Lewis, NBC News, London.
It is a world tragedy. Kiko Itasaka is with us in London, as she is every night. And this really was an extraordinary moment there at Buckingham Palace as the events were remembered by the Palace Guard. Kiko?
Indeed, it was a first in history, and as Dana mentioned in his package, there'll also be special services today at St. Paul's, attended by the Queen, who has been very instrumental in that ceremony at the changing of the at Buckingham Palace about the changing of the guard, and in terms of attending the service today at the cathedral. It's also a day of mourning here in Europe, and throughout all of Europe there will be a moment of silence for 3 minutes at about 11 o'clock. Here in England. And again, I think it's hard to explain and probably difficult for Americans to understand just how moved everybody in Europe is by what is happening. I'd like to show you some of the headlines that are in the papers this morning. God Bless America in one of the tabloids, The Sun, and also in the Daily Mail, Our Loss. Here we start to see photos of the Brits who were lost in the terrible tragedy. I think there are approximately 100 people, at least, English people who were lost in the tragedy. And what we're beginning to find out is that there were many international businesses in the World Trade Center. And so people from all over the world have lost people. That's part of the reason why there is such incredible sympathy everywhere. Forrest? The
world system is certainly interwoven now, and therefore with people living all over the world, all nations are affected by this. But it's not surprising, Kiko, that the NATO countries would rally to support of the United States. It is interesting that there is Kuwait, Qatar, Oman, that have offered their soil to United States forces as in part of a buildup that might be used as a strike against Afghanistan.
I think, Forrest, what we're seeing is that countries that might not normally be the strongest allies of America are recognizing that it is in absolutely no one's interest for there to be a massive world war. And so they, too, are basically saying that they will support the United States, despite the fact that there probably is a certain degree of anti-American sentiment there.
Well, there's also concern about the economic system, and as we pointed out, it's a global economic system. How is the world responding?
Well, interestingly, the Nikkei market today closed up 395.8 points. That's about 4%. It's not huge, but on the other hand, it is up. A lot of economic analysts think that Japan's central bank was very active today in trying to pour money into the system, approximately $16 billion. And that's something we're seeing throughout Europe, that a lot of the central banks seem to be doing their best to prop up the system. Everybody's concerned about what will happen when Wall Street does open. And we talk about NATO and other nations working together with the United States in terms of a reaction to the tragedy. One other thing that's taking place behind the scenes is that banks, investors, analysts everywhere are trying to work out what they need to do to ensure that the world economy doesn't collapse when the markets open Monday.
Kiko Itasaka will, of course, be watching that, and we will continue to speak with you through the morning. Thanks so much, Kiko. It is not only the nations like the G7 and the United States and so on that are trying to keep the economic system calm, to keep investors unworried about how things are going to move forward, to know that these nations are supporting the system. Corporations are doing the same thing. Corporations have rallied, offering charitable assistance and helping the country move forward. Maria Bartiromo of CNBC filed this report.
For the first time since Tuesday, some U.S. exchanges opened for business today. At the Chicago Board of Trade, there was a moment of silence at noon for the victims of Tuesday's attack. The loss of their colleagues in the business community has been staggering. Large and small, so many companies suffered devastating losses in Tuesday's attack. Marsh & McLennan, an insurance company, can only account for 1,000 of its 1,700 employees. At Fred Alger & Company, the president and 38 of its 55 employees housed at the Trade Center are missing. Credit Suisse First Boston had offices at 5 World Trade Center, directly across from the Twin Towers. That building was also severely damaged. While 10% of those employees remain unaccounted for, the firm believes everyone was evacuated in time.
We're making every effort to contact family members and find out.
John Mack is the CEO of CSFB, one of the world's largest investment banks.
I don't think anyone in this business will not be affected by this, will know someone or have a family member or a friend who's been a casualty of this event.
The tragedy also struck a personal note for Mack. He was president of Morgan Stanley for 8 years. And on Tuesday, when he realized the World Trade Center had been hit, like so many others, he raced to the phone.
The first firm I called is my old firm, Morgan Stanley.
You led Morgan Stanley for many years, and I'm sure have many, many personal relationships. Do you know the extent of what has happened?
Well, the first call, it was difficult to reach them. Early on, they were very concerned that the casualty rate would be dramatic. But since that time, it seems that a number of their people were able to get out.
In fact, Morgan Stanley estimates that 3,000 of its 3,500 employees got out safely. The New York Stock Exchange remained closed for the 3rd straight day, the longest shutdown in 80 years. But for now, Mack says the main focus needs to be on employees.
I'm worried about my people. The people here are exhausted. They've been working all day, all night. They are beginning to feel the impact of what's happened to the street, what's happened to their friends and their family. And at the same time, they've been trying to put this market and this infrastructure back up to work.
Getting back to work is important, not just for the business need of the company, but also for the people that survive and need to be able to return to work to continue the life of the organization.
Paul Offman is a psychologist with RHR International, which specializes in helping companies deal with disaster. But he has never seen anything like this.
There's no precedent that I'm aware of in modern time, not related to war, where a large community has had this kind of impact with such tremendous devastation, the dimensions of which we're only going to begin to understand over the coming days and weeks.
It's not hard to look at the devastation and wonder if any of it can be rebuilt. John Mack believes it can, but it will never be like it was before.
I don't think it will ever go back to normal. All you need to do is to drive down the west side and you look down at the very tip of Wall Street and you don't see those two buildings. It will never go back to normal in my view.
It is perhaps a cliche to say that when things are at their worst, Americans are at their best. But it does also seem to be true, doesn't it? This is MSNBC NBC special coverage of a tragedy.
The building where the bomb went off, we don't know, but there's lots of smoke, and we just wanted you to know that I love you always.
was an all-American boy from the get-go.
This country will not relent until we have saved ourselves and others from the terrible tragedy.
After the heavy rains of Thursday night, the skies have cleared, the dusts have settled a bit, and they continue to search. Not since Wednesday have any survivors been found. There have been a number of rumors that perhaps one was found here, perhaps as many as 9 or 10 were found there. All of those rumors have turned out to be false. Good evening, I'm Forrest Sawyer. This is special coverage of the attack against America, against the Twin Towers and the Pentagon. Here is the latest of what's happening. There has been one arrest and a number of people who have been detained at John F. Kennedy Airport and LaGuardia Airport here in New York. Security is, as you can imagine, very high. $40 billion has been earmarked by the United States government for its anti-terrorism campaign, both security and for moving forward in breaking apart what is seen as a worldwide terrorist link. The U.S. is planning that this assault be not a swift one, not one that just comes easily. It will be sustained strikes over a period of time. This is, as President Bush has put it, the first war of the 21st century. The president has also named Friday, the day that we are in just now, as a national day of mourning, of prayer, and of remembrance, remembering the more than 4,700 people who are missing at the World Trade Center, 266 people who were on board those planes, and an unknown number, certainly more than 150 who were lost at the Pentagon. These numbers will certainly continue to rise. And one bit of good news in Pennsylvania, that plane that did not make it to its target, perhaps because the passengers were there to fight off the hijackers, the black box has been recovered, and that should provide us with some information about what went on inside that plane. Now, on Thursday, police, as I told you, did detain or arrest as many as 8 men. This at 2 New York area airports, including one at Kennedy International Airport who appeared to be carrying a suspicious false ID. We have this report, which was taken earlier from MSNBC correspondent Virginia Cha.
According to New York authorities, a man carrying a false pilot's ID, false pilot's identification, was arrested late Thursday afternoon while trying to get through airport security here at JFK. Immediately after that, JFK Airport was shut down. Only planes already in the air heading here were allowed to land. In addition, there have been some conflicting reports, but New York's police commissioner says that 5 to 6 others have been detained for questioning. Some of those, we're told, are Arab nationals. That questioning being conducted by the FBI and members of the Joint Terrorist Task Force. All 3 metropolitan airports shut down Thursday night. The FAA will reassess Friday morning. Now, we have witnessed increased security here at JFK. We are being kept at a distance, but we do have video for you to show you examples of what's happening there. The Port Authority Police building is under heavy armed guard tonight. Port Authority Police making that arrest today at JFK. There are armed police snipers on the roof. There are police on the ground with helmets and rifles. There are barricades keeping unauthorized vehicles out. Also, in terminal areas, there's increased police presence, uniformed officers, and witnessing FBI agents also arriving at the Port Authority building. In addition, U.S. Marshals are on site. They are part of the security plan coming out of Washington to try to make the airports in the United States safer. Now, federal officials have been aware of and, of course, looking for further terrorist activity since the tragedy on Tuesday, and this arrest could be an example of that. Back to you.
All right, that is Virginia Cha. And here is a Reuters bulletin which has just come across the transom. Taliban's leader is insisting that Osama bin Laden is not responsible for the attacks on the U.S. He has said this before, and oddly, this statement is not being taken very seriously here in the United States. Let us go back to South Manhattan now. Rescue efforts have been certainly hampered by a storm that's been moving through the area. NBC's Jeannie Ohm is there in Lower Manhattan. It's cleared up a bit, hasn't it, Jeannie?
Excuse me, Forrest?
I say it's cleared up a bit down there, hasn't it?
It has. You know, the rain has subsided for just a little bit, but the other concern right now, the winds have picked up, and there's still a lot of lightning and thunderstorms back in that area. So some volunteers, more volunteers came out just a short while ago, and they say, yes, they're definitely only working in a very limited location at this time. But you know, city officials say they made substantial progress in just today alone in hauling out a lot more debris and twisted metal. They brought out about 200 truckloads today, and all about 6,000 tons of debris. All of that is being taken to Staten Island, where they can analyze and go through it and look for evidence. But again, at this hour, things have certainly changed because of the weather. Now, all along, search and rescuers were hoping that if there are survivors trapped under the rubble and debris, that they're in little pockets. But you can imagine with so much rain that had come down earlier that they don't want those pockets to fill up. And just to give you an idea of just how much rain we had, they just finished sweeping through these streets, and because there was so much rain, there was actually debris floating up on the streets, but now it subsided a little and they were able to clear it. And again, even though they're not able to do an expansive search, there are still thousands of volunteers back there, and no matter how cold it gets, no matter how wet, and how personally they're uncomfortable, I mean, they want to stay out there, they want to search as long as possible. I do want to mention some other concerns. We talked about it a little yesterday, the stability of some of the surrounding areas. Well, earlier tonight there was some glass falling down from One Liberty Plaza, and that caused a little bit of a panic, so a lot of the volunteers came running up saying, she's going to come down, she's going to come down. But again, we talked with some of the officials, and they say at this point it's okay, but of course it's obviously a situation they are monitoring very closely. And this wind, it's making a lot of clanking noises, so that has a lot of the volunteers a little bit on edge tonight. Forrest?
All right, Jeannie, thanks very much. That's the latest down there at the World Trade Center, and it goes on and it goes on. It is just awful, difficult work, and it's not about to end. A couple of interesting reports that we're just now receiving. Here's an Associated Press report right in Newark. FBI agents have now seized more than a dozen computer hard drives and files that were in a Weehawken warehouse. Weehawken just across the river from New York City. It was at the Urban Moving Systems, done in connection, they believe, with the terrorist attacks. And they also seized a company van in East Rutherford. What they were looking for is not clear, but that has happened. And a report from the Miami Herald saying that the hijackers, we know that some of them were operating down there in Florida. They were getting plane lessons or flight lessons down there, and they do believe that the 5 Florida men suspected to be hijackers in Tuesday's terrorist attack did receive help from local associates. They believe as many as 12 people, including these 5, were involved in all of this. Some of this training, in fact, is very expensive, and these 5 people seem to live as college students do, not working and spending cash. And so investigators believe that they must have been getting the cash from somewhere. This investigation is spreading out into so many directions. What they are trying to do, of course, is find out exactly who these suspects were, to dig past the false IDs that they operated with, and critically, looking out through the United States, find out who these people were that operated in the infrastructure that supported them. NBC's Pete Williams has more.
Federal agents respond immediately. More than 4,000 FBI special agents and 3,000 support staff already on the case, sweeping the nation for evidence from fragments at the scene of the attacks to any documentary proof of what the suspected terrorists were up to. Between 3 and 6 per plane, authorities now say.
The United States Attorney's Office's terrorism units and the FBI's Joint Terrorism Task Forces are obtaining the passenger manifests, rental car receipts, telephone logs, videotape from parking garages, and pay telephone videotape records at all scenes for review and appropriate follow-up interviews.
Scrutiny of those passenger lists leads the FBI to this flight school in Florida, where officials say they believe at least 2 of the terrorists received pilot training during the past year. A man who worked at the flight school says he allowed both of them, who described themselves as Germans, to briefly live with him and his wife.
While they were here, I know that they had used this address initially and I know that because I would get insurance renewals for them addressed to them at this address for that call.
In Boston, agents swarm area hotels where registration records match suspicious names from passenger lists of the hijacked planes, detaining at least 3 people for further questioning, holding them now on immigration charges. And in a hugely helpful break, the FBI impounds a car found at the airport after a witness says it was driven by 2 Arabic men. In it, authorities say they discover airplane technical documents. Federal agents also stop an Amtrak train in Rhode Island today, part of a frantic nationwide effort, the FBI says, to make certain no other conspirators remain at large where they could mount further attacks.
Our first effort is to identify any associates in the United States who might be related to the hijackers and to remove those associates, investigate, and arrest, given the evidence, those individuals, and to remove any threat to the air system in the future.
Among other searches today, agents descend upon this mailbox rental office in New Jersey, where some of the suspected terrorists may have received their mail.
They are looking in so many different directions. One of the big stories that we're following tonight is one that's in the Boston Globe. They are saying that investigators have evidence that the planning of these suicide hijackings was underway for as long as 5 years, that people actually had been put in place here in the United States through all of that time, and that for at least 6 months, Logan Airport had been cased. In fact, there was a ramp access list that they had so that they were able to get into various places all around Logan Airport as they were doing this casing. Now that suggests not only that they could get around, but they had some help in getting that kind of ramp access pass. They also have evidence suggesting that at least 5 of the 10 men had Saudi Arabian identification. Remember, Saudi Arabia is an ally of the United States, and therefore it is believed that perhaps by having these IDs rather than other Arab country IDs, they would have avoided the kind of close scrutiny they might otherwise have gotten. All of this is an indication of how a terrorist cell or cells operate here in the United States. Let's look a little closer. Here is NBC's Fred Francis.
The CIA estimates that Osama bin Laden has hundreds of these cells in 50 countries, including, one official said, many in this country.
One of their modus operandi is to move what we call sleepers or submarines into a community, and in some cases keep them there for years.
As many as 5,000 cell agents have been trained using this so-called Encyclopedia of Afghan Jihad, Holy War, captured by U.S. personnel, detailing everything from communication security to bomb making. Then they often participate in local groups in the community and wait.
There was one case where they were prominent members of the local PTA. Another in the World Trade Center bombing was worked for a respected chemical company.
Techniques used by Ramzi Youssef, who ran several bin Laden cells in the 90s. He was caught and convicted in the first attack on the World Trade Center.
He failed in that attack because he couldn't get a hold of enough explosives, and it appears that the bomb was placed by the wrong support column. But clearly where he failed, it's possible that other people inspired by him have succeeded now.
Analysts say the cell Youssef ran in this apartment in Manila 6 years ago was like the cells that pulled off yesterday's attack. His plan, called Operation Bojinka, 5 men independent of each other, planting bombs in 11 jumbo jets, timed to go off in 48 hours over the Pacific. Youssef's captured computer gave up exact tail numbers of the targeted planes, also an unbreakable code used to communicate so no one person knows enough to compromise the operation.
And there's one person in the cell who's responsible for communicating with other cells or with the superstructure of the organization.
Also in that computer 6 years ago, a plan to crash into the CIA with a U.S. airliner loaded with explosives. Today, sources say, cells use anonymous emailing to message each other, often not knowing to whom they are communicating. All this confirmed by several bin Laden agents now in U.S. prisons.
Let's look a little closer at how these terrorist cells operate. With us is Antonio Mendez. He is a longtime CIA officer. He is author of Master of Disguise, My Secret Life in the CIA. And as you were listening to that report, is that kind of standard operating procedure for these cells?
Well, the more I hear, the more impressed I become about their discipline and their resolve, as well as their sophistication. It's an amazing bit of work on their part. You know, as a professional, I have to kind of be impressed as well as being repulsed by this group.
It makes it difficult for investigators, I would assume, because they got cutouts at various points.
Absolutely. The you know, would all our operations be as tightly secured as some of theirs?
Antonio, we've talked about how good they are. We've talked about how sophisticated they are. Let's turn it over. Where are their weaknesses? Where can these kinds of operations be attacked?
Well, it's clear that they are leaving a trail that we would not want to leave in a good clandestine operation. It's clear that they have that suicide attitude and not really trying to cover their tracks, and that's a bit of sloppiness, but certainly they are well disciplined in terms of going after their target.
You know, that's something I don't really understand. If they are that disciplined at the outset, if they are so careful in trying to cover up their tracks before an operation, why would they be so incredibly messy afterwards, leaving a trail that you could follow blindfolded?
Because they have an agenda, and that agenda is to cause attention to their cause. So even though they deny that it was them at the end, they signal the fact that they're going to do it. You know, bin Laden's pattern is to make threats and then to carry out his threats and then to deny it. But it's all by way of getting attention, and that's their agenda.
I have heard a lot of people ask what it is that they hoped to accomplish by doing this. Do they believe that the United States resolve would actually be broken by this act?
Well, I'm not really sure what they hope to achieve other than the fact that they want to call attention. But you know, I think the other notable thing here, the thing that is amazing, is the fact that they end up committing suicide even though they've been waiting in place for maybe 2 to 5 years. That kind of stability is just really notable.
I wonder if that suggests that there's some sort of reinforcing mechanism here in the United States. While they're living here, they must have a fairly strong sense of community one with another.
Yeah, even though we're seeing a lot of foreigners in this mix, you know, we have to understand that this isn't truly a global effort on their part, and a lot of them are part of this society. You know, a lot of them are U.S. persons of some sort, so they have an infrastructure here.
It's going to make it very difficult. Antonio Mendez, former CIA officer, author of Master of Disguise, My Secret Life in the CIA. Thank you, sir.
Yes.
And so the war is on. It has been declared by whoever these forces are, and it has been picked up by the United States. The President of the United States has said, indeed, this is war, and Congress has already echoed that statement. We move forward. Question is, can the United States win this war? Andrea Mitchell files this report.
Out of the ashes of disaster, a U.S. determination to wage a crusade against terror on every front. But the enemy is elusive, mysterious, and dedicated, leading the dispossessed of the Islamic world in a holy war against the United States, with 21st century technology and medieval ferocity.
You're dealing with a very, very skilled, knowledgeable, thinking enemy, and we just have to think better than them, think faster than them, and be cleverer than them.
It's a hatred rooted in Osama bin Laden's fury after U.S. troops rescued his native Saudi Arabia from Saddam Hussein. To bin Laden, the American-led coalition and its Western culture defiled the holiest sites in the Muslim world. Further enraged by American support for Israel, U.S. indictments say bin Laden first targeted American troops in Somalia, then Saudi Arabia, Yemen, and now suicide hijackings in the United States.
They're willing to die. They're not only willing to die, they're willing to spend years studying something, knowing that the end result is not to become an airline pilot or to make a lot of money flying people around the world, but to crash into a building.
How does a civilized nation following the rule of law win a fight with fanatics? Today, a former president and past CIA director says we have to fight dirty, without one arm tied behind our backs.
And if you're going to infiltrate some cell somewhere, or a terrorist cell, you have to deal with people that are willing to betray their country, people that are willing to betray their friends, people that want money or other things, and it's not pleasant.
The first challenge, infiltrating a closed society, bin Laden's secret training camps, a tribal culture of family members.
We've got to go after the training camps. We've got to go after and eradicate the very idea of training people for terrorism in the world.
And in a world where bin Laden uses the latest technology to hide his secret commands, how much of a barrier are preventive steps like banning curbside baggage check-in?
They will try to find other areas where we are vulnerable, particularly in such areas as cyber vulnerability, chemical and biological weapons.
Well, make no mistake about it, this president and this Congress, and I suspect also this nation, means to strike out against the terrorists who struck out against us. President Bush was very emotional today. Let's listen to a little bit of it.
I think about myself right now. I think about the families, the children. I'm a loving guy, and I'm also someone, however, who's got a job to do, and I intend to do it. And this is a terrible moment, but this country will not relent until we have saved ourselves and others from the terrible tragedy that came upon America.
In past conflicts, notably the Vietnam War and, in fact, the Gulf War, Americans have been divided about whether they should be involved in the ways that they were. They have been divided about the goals that were trying to be achieved. In this case, it is very clear that the heart of the nation has been struck at by terrorists that have nothing but hate for what this country stands for, and therefore Americans seem to be uniting in a very powerful way behind what the president was saying today. Here is Josh Mankiewicz to talk about that unity.
And I am confident there will be universal approval of the actions this government takes.
And right now, at least, Mr. Bush is correct. Public opinion polling shows widespread support for a president heading into the biggest test of leadership any chief executive has faced since World War II. It would be a titanic task for any president. At once, comfort a stunned nation, rally international support, pursue and find the terrorists, correct an astonishing failure of U.S. intelligence, and on an almost daily basis, send unmistakable signals to more than 270 million Americans that he has both hands firmly on the wheel.
Crisis brings out either the best or the worst in a leader.
Dr. Michael Genovese of Loyola Marymount University has written extensively about presidential power and leadership.
Jimmy Carter faced the crisis of the Iran hostage situation and seemed to get smaller and smaller as the months went by. Other presidents, Lincoln, for example, face a crisis and seem to get bigger and bigger.
Presidents Reagan and Clinton also seem to rise to the occasion in difficult times. Mr. Reagan after the Space Shuttle Challenger exploded, and Bill Clinton after the terrorist attack in Oklahoma City.
We cannot let terrorists and rogue nations hold this nation hostile or hold...
But even his strongest supporters would admit that George W. Bush is not in the same league as Presidents Reagan or Clinton when it comes to public speaking. And in a culture of television, talking to a country that's ready for some inspiration, it's a handicap Mr. Bush and the team around him will have to overcome.
He's seen the way other presidents like Reagan and Clinton handle the great rhetorical moment, and he knows he doesn't have that skill. And what he tries to project instead is a kind of steadiness.
Lawrence O'Donnell is the senior political analyst for MSNBC. He says Mr. Bush is going to have to change his style from CEO to front man, especially if the president's war against terrorism turns bloody.
So he has to sort of be the official spokesman for this war. He can't leave that to others.
He can't delegate it. He has to be out there explaining in order to preserve the support, in order to keep the country behind him. He needs to have a more inclusive conversation with the American public on an ongoing basis than he ever anticipated having as a president on any subject.
But the horror in New York makes one part of the president's job easier. Until now, our response to terrorism has been primarily technological because of the belief that Americans wouldn't support a war that produced U.S. casualties. But all that changed Tuesday morning.
This is a country that does not so much need to be led, but simply told what the marching orders are.
What would make you the best candidate in office during the Middle East crisis?
I've been a leader. I've been a person who has to set a clear vision and convince people to follow.
During the 2000 presidential campaign, Mr. Bush sold himself as a proven leader. But his foreign policy experience has been limited mostly to some on-the-job training.
Right. Good evening, everyone.
However, Americans do have plenty of confidence in the team around Mr. Bush. And as a country, we're clearly ready to let a new president lead us on a crusade against an enemy with no fixed borders and no home address.
If history's a guide, how long is this tremendous support for President Bush likely to last?
Historically, presidents in a crisis get a rally around the flag effect where they get a boost in their popularity and increased support. It doesn't last a real long time. It can last several months at the outset. And the next step is, what does the president do with this blip in support, with this increased support?
The national pressure to take swift, decisive action may be overwhelming, but it's taking the right action that's a true test of leadership. And so the next few months will be a test not only for the president, but for the people he governs as well.
Support around the idea that terrorism should be fought does not mean, however, that mistakes have not been made. Here is one, according to a newspaper in the northern German city of Hanover. It's reporting today that an Iranian man that the paper identifies as Ali S. was held in custody at a Hanover prison awaiting extradition from Germany, and that this man, using telephone numbers that he already had in his possession, was allowed to dial the White House and the United States Secret Service. And he told them that there were imminent fatal attacks on their way of such an order that they would change the world order. He was believed to be insane by German officials, and when he told Secret Service agents, and he did get through to them, that he was in prison in Germany, the Secret Service officer with whom he was speaking simply hung up the phone. Now, there is no clear evidence that this man actually knew anything about these attacks, although it is fair to say that there are those who believe that this particular cell may have started somewhere in Germany. Let us go now to the Pentagon, where, as you know, the one plane struck a portion of the building, and some 190 people, it is now believed, may have been killed. That includes the people who were on the plane, but that number is far from certain. There were some flames that rose up today, and Ron is there to give us the latest. Ron?
Yeah, Forrest, about 6 hours ago, a bit of a surprise tonight. They thought all the fire danger had been put behind them, but at about 9:15, all of a sudden, flames shot up and very quickly climbed up almost to the 5-story height there. It took about 10 minutes. The firefighters moved in very quick. It poured a lot of water on that quick flare-up, but that pretty much put a halt to any of the shoring up efforts. Today they have been looking into that. Imagine a giant pickup sticks pile of steel girders in concrete, and each time you pull a piece out it becomes unstable. That's what's holding things up right now. They'd like to get in there to do more recovery efforts for the bodies. They want to get to the black box that's off the airplane so they can hear the cockpit voice recorder, but they can't do that until they shore things up. 3 of the main supports there in that structural area were all knocked out when the aircraft went plunging in there at an estimated 600 miles an hour. And right now they've got to carefully get in there and start shoring it up, much like a coal mine is shored up against collapse. And they were moving in there today with some timbers and trying to do that. Perhaps even the timbers caught fire. They think that a pool of residual jet fuel inside the structure may have caught fire, as some hot embers may have fallen into it. After all, remember, that structure burned for a couple of days after the impact. Earlier today, the military said they had thought they had a handle on the numbers of the number of fatalities here, about 190. That includes the 64 souls lost on board the airplane, the other 120 plus the military personnel that are still unaccounted for. They released about 40 plus names today of people they'd identified, next of kin had been notified. And just to look at the sweep and how much the nation will be touched by this, just from the announcement here, more than 22 states by my count touched in terms of where the military personnel had come from, military and civilian employees of the Pentagon. Right now, Forrest, they have 2 search and rescue teams that are on duty tonight. We can't see any real activity over there since the fire. Perhaps they're still inside the structure in those burned out wings that adjoin that collapsed area that you saw back there. But at this point, there's not a lot of visual activity in the middle of the night. Forrest?
Ron, am I right? They more or less know where the black box is? It's been pinging away?
Well, you know, there was some conflicting information on that. At one point, the fire department said, we know where it is, we heard the pinging, but the NTSB was telling Robert Hager of NBC News that they were not hearing that. But the back of the tail section has kind of an orange coating to it in color, and they thought they were seeing some of that wreckage in the debris, but they haven't been able to get to it and probably won't until they finish shoring it up.
Well, it's got to be in there somewhere. Ron Bloom, thanks very much, Ron. Of course, one of the questions that has arisen out of all of this is how in the world these hijackers could have taken over the planes and then flown them directly into the buildings, the Pentagon and the Twin Towers. And part of the reason that they were able to do it is that they had trained as pilots, and they had trained as pilots right here in the United States. Terry Sanders files this report. Well, as you can see, we're having some difficulty with that report. Terry Sanders did file the report, and one of the things that we had learned was that they, using the Saudi Arabian identification, were able to be trained down there in Florida. Now, there is some dispute about whether that Saudi Arabian identification, because Saudi Arabia is an ally of the United States, would be terribly helpful, but there are people in Florida who are saying indeed it was helpful, and the reason that it was is because it doesn't get the kind of scrutiny that they would have gotten had they had identification from another part of the world, from some other Arab nation that is not so friendly to the United States. Now, there are people in the United States government who say that's not true, but that at least is hanging out there. And we had this report, of course, from the Boston Globe, and I think it's the report of the evening. It's coming out in this morning's newspapers, that investigators have evidence not only that these pilots were down in Florida training away on flight simulators and on airplanes and using identifications saying that they were pilots associated with Saudi Arabian Airlines, but that they in fact had been on the ground for 5 years, for as long as 5 years, planning for this activity. And for 6 months they had been casing Logan Airport. Now understand the sophistication that is involved here. We have 18 people who were involved in these 4 planes, teams of 5 on 2 of them, teams of 4 on 2 of them, and those 5 men on each plane, 4 men on 2 other planes, were able to move forward, overpower the people who were on the planes, take them over, and dive them in. To accomplish that, they had to have assistance on the ground, and they did have that assistance, it is believed. The question is, how many people were involved there? It certainly seems that there were a lot of them. Let us go now to Terry Sanders' package on the training of the pilots down in Florida.
23-year-old Marwan al-Shahi, one of the suspected suicide pilots, hiding in plain view on Florida's Gulf Coast for more than 7 months, living with 33-year-old Mohammed Atta, another suspected suicide pilot. After both earned their commercial flight ratings on this twin-engine plane, NBC News has learned they came to Miami, paying $1,500 in cash to sit at the controls of a Boeing 727 flight simulator, similar to this one. Henry George, the instructor, telling the FBI the duo spent about 6 hours at the controls.
I feel violated, raped, whatever. Here I have a skill that I'm very proud of, that I think we're good at, passing on to other pilots wanting to become competent pilots. And here we provided that kind of expertise to the lowest of mankind.
FBI agents also looking at a Microsoft Flight Simulator program. You can buy it for $70 at any computer store. For $30 more, you can add the simulated cockpit of an American Airlines 757, similar to the jet that hit Tower 1. Today Show travel editor Peter Greenberg says the programs are popular.
A lot of pilots and non-pilots buy these simulators to either train or to actually just have fun, to see what they can do with it, like fly under the Golden Gate Bridge or even fly around or sometimes into like the John Hancock Building in Chicago as a game. Nothing they would ever contemplate doing in real life.
But the instruction manual gives you plenty of information you would need if you wanted to fly into any landmark around the world. Just look up the World Trade Center, for instance, and find its coordinates. We asked a licensed pilot in our office to take the controls and fly down the west side of Manhattan. He had little difficulty taking it right on into Tower 1. Only a simulation, but chilling.
You might actually be able to do a practice run just like we did.
Veteran commercial airline pilot Alex Garmendia using the program for the first time today. He says after hours on this software, a novice pilot without experience in a jet would still lack the skills to do much of the controls.
But it surely shows you the cockpit layout.
In FBI custody tonight, Anand Bukhari, a material witness reportedly cooperating with investigators. His Vero Beach home raided by agents. His brother dying in a mid-air collision in Florida while learning to fly here. That accident 1 year ago to the day of the hijackings. The FBI's leads in Florida growing exponentially. FBI agents visiting a strip club in Daytona Beach. Just hours before the hijackings, 3 Middle Eastern men there hinted at the violence to come.
One of the gentlemen actually making the statement, well, America's going to see blood and wait till tomorrow.
There you are, that report from Terry Sanders. Incidentally, another report, this one out of Reuters in Islamabad. The leader of Afghanistan's ruling Taliban party is saying that Saudi-born dissident Osama bin Laden did not do the things of which he is accused. This is Mullah Muhammad Omar saying in a statement released in Pakistan that neither Osama bin Laden nor Afghanistan had the capacity to train the suicide pilots who crashed the hijacked aircraft. Here is the statement. Training of pilots is the work of a running government, and only such a government has the capacity to do so. Osama has no pilots, and where did he train them? In Afghanistan, there is no such possibility for the training. Answer, he trained them in Florida, if indeed it was Osama bin Laden who was behind it. Let us go now to Islamabad, Pakistan. On the phone, we have NBC's Tom Asbel. Now, it is Pakistan that the United States is pressuring in a very significant measure. Pakistan has been a big supporter of the Taliban. Pakistan is a neighbor of Afghanistan, and the United States would like Pakistan's assistance in bringing Osama bin Laden to justice. What is the latest there, Tom?
Here in Islamabad, Islamabad's main airport was closed for 2 hours this morning. The authorities here in Pakistan say it was for security reasons, for anti-terrorism reasons, and also for the movement of military equipment. Now, it's unsure whether that equipment would have been Pakistani or even early arriving American equipment. What the Americans are looking for from the Pakistanis is cooperation, primarily military aid, that is permission for overflights of, for example, cruise missiles or strike aircraft, should there be a decision to go up against Afghanistan in the form of military strikes, and also logistical support. But more importantly, they want intelligence information from Pakistan, the exact location of Osama bin Laden and where his bases are inside Afghanistan. Now, so far, Pakistan has been making all the right noises towards the United States. It's offered condolences and indeed made offers of support. Although the Pakistanis have been supporting the Taliban since 1996, their relationship with Afghanistan goes back indeed to the early 1970s. So the Pakistanis probably not only geographically the closest to the Afghanis, but also with wide-ranging contacts inside the country with the Taliban military, and also, it is believed, with the groups that support Osama bin Laden. Forrest?
Tom, you rightly point out that Pakistani leader Musharraf has been making all the right noises. He has been saying that he will certainly cooperate with the United States. But here we see the Taliban clearly digging in their heels, saying that Osama bin Laden has done nothing wrong and the United States has got it all wrong. So that puts Pakistan in a difficult position, doesn't it?
Well, it certainly does. The leader of Pakistan, General Pervez Musharraf, does not have the complete support of all the military behind him, particularly when it comes to Afghanistan. And indeed, 3 years ago, when there were cruise missile strikes in the wake of the attacks on the embassies on the American embassies in East Africa, there were riots in the streets because Pakistan gave permission for overflights of cruise missiles. So General Musharraf here has to be very careful that he doesn't alienate large sections of the population and indeed some sections of his military. There have already been statements issued by Islamic groups inside Pakistan warning him of any cooperation with the United States. So he has to tread very carefully, while of course reassuring the Americans that he'll do everything he can to help Forrest.
Good point. It's not only the military. In fact, there are a number of people there in Pakistan who consider Osama bin Laden to be quite a hero. So just how far can he go?
Well, the general, as I said, could probably get away again with granting overflight permission, either for strike aircraft or cruise missiles. I think to give American forces any kind of bases inside Pakistan, and that's probably the big decision he has to make at the moment, I think that would be a little far removed from his agenda at the moment, however. Inside Pakistan, there are many Islamic groups that are not only anti-American, but very pro-Taliban and indeed pro-Osama bin Laden. So any decision on how far he'd go, he has to take into account all voices here. Last night he met with his general military staff for all sorts of contingency planning, and again this morning there were meetings with political leaders. There's been no announcement from the government as to their intentions yet. I think he's playing it very carefully at the moment and hoping indeed that time is on his side, that the investigation in the United States will take quite a long time to complete so that he doesn't have to make that decision right away.
He might be mistaken on that count. Tom Asbel is there in Pakistan and is a delicate balance. Thanks so much, Tom. Now, one of the companies housed in the World Trade Center is one called Cantor Fitzgerald, that is a leading bond trading company. It lost 700 employees. Only by accident did its CEO survive. NBC's Bob McEwen has details.
Here and abroad, they were the ultimate symbols of America and American business. The Twin Towers, home to some of the giants of U.S. finance. You may well not know its name, but one of those companies is called Cantor Fitzgerald. Cantor Fitzgerald dominates the bond market. Last year, the firm did $50 trillion in business. But according to Chairman and CEO Howard Lutnick, what's made him most proud isn't its bottom line, but the kind of company it is.
We are a family. We are the tightest group of people. And we always have been a tight group of people. But you just don't know it. We did know it, but in this last couple of days, I mean, it's unbelievable.
And how long these past few days must have been for Howard Lutnick. In a catastrophe that's crushed an entire country, no one can have been hit harder than he has.
We have lost every single person who was in the office. We don't know of any, not a single one person getting down from the 101st to the 105th floors where our offices were, not a single person.
Incredibly, it was just over 48 hours ago that Cantor Fitzgerald was on top of the financial world and of the World Trade Center. The firm occupied 4 floors high up in the North Tower, from the 101st to the 105th. 1,000 employees, traders and executives, secretaries and support staff went to work there every day. But this Tuesday, CEO Howard Lutnick was going to be late. He didn't want to miss his son's first day in kindergarten.
I mean, I wasn't there because I dropped my baby off at school for my 5-year-old's first day of school, but that means that I get there late. That means I get to be alive. And anybody who got there early doesn't get to. It's unthinkable.
Even without him, the day began as it often does, with a conference call between New York and the office in Los Angeles. At about 8:45, over the speakerphone, Cantor Fitzgerald employees on the West Coast heard someone in New York say, "I think a plane just hit us."
I got a call as I was leaving my son's school that there was, a plane hit the Trade Center. So we went right down at the top of the building, and I saw a lot of smoke, and I knew it was not good. Not good. And all I was saying on the way down is, it's not good. This is not good.
The first jetliner had smashed into the North Tower at about the 90th story, not far below where Cantor Fitzgerald's offices began, on the 101st. An inferno of jet fuel now rampaged upwards, consuming floor after floor.
It's unfathomable that everyone would die. It's not possible. Someone would get out. So all I wanted was to hear one person say they were on 101. Just one person who was on 101. People coming out of the building, and I'd grab them, and they're sort of like out of it. And I'd take them and say, what floor are you on? And I got all the police around that door, just shake people and say, what floor are you on? And they'd say 50. And I'd scream out there, I got 50, and a 60, and a 70. I got up to 91. Someone said they worked on the 91st floor, and they came down and they got out. And then the building collapsed. I don't have anybody. I don't have anybody.
With people off on vacation or business trips, and those who simply got to work late, Lutnick now believes everyone who was in the office that day perished. About 700 in all.
There's 700 of my families. I can't say it. 700 of my families. 700. I'm just one, but they were all 700. There's so many of them. They all lost their son or their daughter. People come up to me and say, I only have one daughter. What do? This is too many. Too many. Too many.
Is there any way to describe what these past few days have been like for you?
They're a blur. They're a blur of crying and hugs, of trying to help people and give them information when there isn't really any positive news to give. To be strong enough to help them. But I'm just another one of them. And it's just the world moving like at a snail's pace. The day just lasts forever, and every minute is extended and young.
And he says every minute of every day has been spent trying to find someone, anyone, who's missing. Cantor Fitzgerald has established a crisis center at New York's Hotel Pierre with grief counselors and a list of those employees who went to work on Tuesday but never went home.
All of the families, they hunt down every lead, they run every place, they go to every hospital with this employee list. I make sure that we go with our list of 700 people and say, find someone on this list. Find me someone on this list. Because someone on this list means that I can call a family and I can tell them that they have a reason to not be sad anymore.
But as of today, they've located only 4 hospitalized Cantor Fitzgerald employees, each of whom was just arriving at the World Trade Center when the attack took place. And as if all the rest of it weren't too much for one person to bear, one of those 700 employees they haven't found is Howard Lutnick's own brother.
My brother Gary. Yeah, he called my sister. And we got lots of people got phone calls. Probably 100 people got phone calls after the plane hit. You know, they called their family, they called their mother, they called their wife and said, you know, we've been hit by a plane and we're evacuating. I mean, that was the common thread. My brother called my sister a little later and he said the smoke was pouring in, there was no way out, and he's not going to make it.
That was just 2 days ago. This morning, after a moment of silence commemorating those who died, the U.S. financial markets started trading bonds again. Howard Lutnick says he asked his surviving employees what they wanted to do. They voted. Then they told him, let's go back to work.
So they lost the person to their left and the person to their right, but they've decided that that's what they're going to do. And so this morning at 7 o'clock in the morning, 7 o'clock in the morning, my staff in Europe and here opened the U.S. government securities market, and it's a miracle. These people, I don't know, they're just, they didn't sleep. Since losing all their friends, they didn't sleep once. They decided they wanted to go to work. Why would they want to go to work? But that's what they wanted to do. Certainly not what I asked them to do. And it's just, these people are just, these are spectacular people. Spectacular people.
And in return, Cantor Fitzgerald's CEO made a promise to the families of the colleagues and friends who may be gone, but never forgotten.
Within the company that when we, everything is different. It is everything different. But what it's going to be is we are going to, as a company, we are going to take care of and do everything we can as a different business model to take care of the people, the families that we lost. Because it's not about us. I get to kiss my kid. I get to kiss my kid. But now I got people's wives calling me. They don't know what to do. I mean, I had a very young staff. The probably average age was the young 30s. That means they all have babies. They had babies. So we got a lot of people to take care of. We have a lot of people to take care of. A lot of people to take care of. And that's what we're going to do. That's what I'm going to do. And that's what my staff is going to do, because that's what we're committed to do.
Families are strange things. Sometimes they are connected by genetics, whoever you're related to by birth. Sometimes they are connected by association, and as you see, those connections can be very strong indeed. One great family is that of the New York firefighters. These are men and women who go into harm's way to rescue others, and they did that in this case. Many of them, hundreds of them, rushing into the World Trade Center towers to try to rescue people, and then only to have the building collapse around them. And so many of the firehouses have been empty tonight. Hundreds have lost their lives. Donna Fratangelo about the missing firefighters.
They are not blood relatives, but without a doubt, they are family. Firefighters in New York grappling with what has become of their band of brothers and sisters. There's Engine 54 on 48th Street in Manhattan. The pride of Midtown, it's known as. 14 members were on duty Tuesday. 14 have not yet returned.
We haven't lost anybody yet. We're missing 14 members from this house. 14 brothers went, 6 from each company and 2 from the battalion. We have not found or heard from them. We're still hoping that they're alive, and we're just waiting. It's, it's a tragedy, just waiting.
Waiting's the toughest. So too is resting. But that's what will give them energy to get back to the rubble to search. Lieutenant Bob Jackson is anxious to find his buddy, Captain Dave Woolley, a 30-year veteran.
Dave was a good guy, good tease. He knew how to twist my, push a button to get me going, and then he'd turn around and smile at me. He took me under his wing, just, teaching me stuff.
This whiteboard is usually used by the firehouse to assign seating on a fire truck. This list of names, now a stark reminder of the truck that didn't return. And they don't even want to think about them not returning, hoping their missing friends will be rescued. And today there was good reason to think so. Several firefighters have been found alive among the rubble. Incredibly, 3 of them were able to walk out of the wreckage. But those kinds of discoveries have been the exception.
We're very tight here. Everybody's very close. You know everybody in the firehouse. You know their wives. You know their kids. You lose it, Fred.
Lieutenant Mark Munley, a 16-year veteran, grief-stricken about the 10 missing members of his firehouse on 51st Street in Midtown Manhattan.
Everybody you think will fall down there from this house is missing.
Half the men from the firehouse responded to the World Trade Center. The other half could not.
Trying to be sent there, calling dispatcher, asking us to send us there, and they couldn't get through to dispatcher, and the guys feel strange.
Lieutenant Munley and his fellow members of Engine 8 now wrestle with guilt. Why couldn't they get there?
You want to be available. You want to go to where the action is. You want to help people. That's what we do. You don't shy away from that stuff. No one ever thinks that this is going to happen, that it's going to be a disaster.
Even so, he knows what the outcome likely would have been.
Know that if you could have been there, you would have been there, and something terrible could have happened.
It's been 2.5 days now, and it's not getting any easier at Lieutenant Munley's firehouse.
We're all close. I mean, Captain Mills, Captain Latitude, Chief Pietros, I mean, we're close to them all.
There's an empty space now in the row of hanging jackets where the missing firefighters' jackets would have been. An emptiness that's being experienced at firehouses throughout the city. A board with wishes of gratitude now lines this firehouse wall as residents try to thank these men with kindness and charity. Engine Company 6 is nicknamed the Tammany Hall Tigers, originally a volunteer squad founded by New York's Boss Tweed. It's housed in a 100-year-old building where the tradition continues that a firefighter never leaves behind one of their colleagues. The night shift was just going off duty when the call came in around 9 a.m. They did what other firefighters would do. They joined the day shift and went out on the job. Jumping on the back of the engine truck, 33-year-old Tommy Houlihan, a 6-year veteran.
Angela, there's 4 guys from 6 Engine who are missing, and I'm not leaving until they find them.
Tommy Houlihan was among the 4 firefighters from Engine Company 6 who disappeared in the smoke and rubble. Timothy Dowling was the commanding officer at Engine 6 until 1993, when he was injured in the first World Trade Center bombing and forced to retire. But he had to come back to Engine 6.
After all the excitement of Tuesday, I couldn't stay at home. My nephew is assigned to this firehouse, and he's among the missing firefighters. So the only place I could be here with all my firefighters that I've known for the last 12 years.
Tommy Houlihan is the nephew of retired Captain Dowling. Like many firefighters, it's in the family blood. Tommy's grandfather was a battalion commander who died on the job.
Mother is really, it's devastating. She had lost her father, and now she's losing her son. We hope not.
A list on this chalkboard shows the names of the men who went out on that job that morning, including Tommy Houlihan. Next to it, a map, a sketch of where Engine 6 had parked in front of the World Trade Center. The firehouse is not its usual ordered self now. Bunker gear is thrown around, some is missing, borrowed by visiting firemen. The kitchen isn't working, nor is there power. But last night, some women came by with hot food, and the men decided it was time to break bread together.
The church of the Pompeii over in Greenwich Village came by. They dropped off food. The people of the city are just incredible.
Meanwhile, the search for Tommy Houlihan and the other 3 men from Engine Company 6 goes on. A family, a band of brothers and sisters, now broken.
Some news that we're receiving this morning, offers of assistance are coming to the United States from all around the world. Turkey has offered a 12-member team to assist. The Dalai Lama has offered $30,000 as a symbolic gesture of the Tibetan people's solidarity with the people of New York. The European Commission has offered its assistance. Belgium, France, Sweden, Ireland, Spain, Italy, Finland, the Netherlands, Britain. Foreign corporations, including some from Germany, have offered their assistance. Canadian banks have offered their assistance, and OPEC countries as well have offered to do what they can to try to maintain stable oil prices in these difficult times. A bit of other news. Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, according to the New York Times, has asked for a call-up of reserves, as many as 50,000 military reservists to come up as they go on to mobilization and the United States goes on to war footing. This mobilization order is awaiting President Bush's signature right now. And as for support around the country, in the San Francisco Bay Area, which, as you know, is a hotbed of liberalism and sometimes some would say even radicalism, the idea of U.S. military retaliation is not a happy one, usually, but the terrorist attack, it appears, has struck a different kind of chord. The reaction much different this time. One activist saying, "I'm a die-hard, non-violent activist. It's difficult for me to see how retaliation would help anyone, but I don't think those of us at those kind of feeling have the same reaction right now." That is the news of the morning. This is NBC, MSNBC coverage of a tragedy. I'm Forrest Sawyer.
hit the building or a bomb went off. We don't know, but there's lots of smoke, and we just wanted you to know that I love you always.
My brother was an all-American boy from the get-go.
This country will not relent until we have saved ourselves and others from the terrible tragedy.
a.m. on the East Coast, the long hours of the early morning, the hard hours when the dust settles in around you, when the bones ache as you wait for the sunlight to come, when the chill of a thunderstorm makes it even more difficult to go on with the work, but the workers do go on. 24 hours a day they labor, hoping to find someone alive as they move through that difficult construction site or deconstruction site, trying to be very careful in the way that they move, trying to be very careful in the way that they look for bodies, hoping that they'll find someone alive. Here is the latest that we're following this morning. I'm Forrest Sawyer, and there has been a possible attack warning, some do believe. This story out of Germany. A man apparently, according to German newspapers, picked up the phone from a German prison and tried to call the White House and the Secret Service to say that there was a terrible attack that would change the world order coming. They say that he did get through to a Secret Service officer, but when he told them he was calling from a prison, that officer hung up. There has been a search of a warehouse in Weehawken, New Jersey, just across the river from New York. More than a dozen computer hard drives have been picked up there. It is not yet known if any of the terrorists might have been associated with that as well. $40 billion asked for by the president, likely granted very soon by Congress. This for the anti-terrorism activities, not only security, but the search for terrorists worldwide. There has been one arrest and several detainees at JFK Airport and LaGuardia Airport here in New York. President Bush planning to visit New York after he goes to the National Cathedral today. Remember, he has named Friday as a day of mourning and of remembrance and of national prayer. And out in Pennsylvania, where that one plane crashed, not able to reach its target for reasons perhaps caused by the passengers overpowering the hijackers, many believe so. The black box has been recovered, and that should likely give us some indication as to what went on inside that plane. Now, there is a front page story in this morning's Boston Globe saying that investigators do have evidence that the planning of these suicide hijackings of the 4 airlines, possibly more airlines, were planned, began at least 5 years ago. The article reports that the men who commandeered 2 Boston flights began casing Logan Airport in Boston at least 6 months ago using a ramp access pass that ordinary citizens are not supposed to have. I spoke earlier by phone with Boston Globe reporter Kevin Cullen, who has been covering the investigation. Walk me through this, Kevin. Give me a sense of what it is that you're uncovering.
Well, myself and a colleague, Shelley Murphy, were able to piece together some things, mostly from investigators, also from making some phone calls. It seems that whoever put this group up to it, whoever organized this, had a long-range plan, what the Russians used to call a 5-year plan. And what it began with was training a number of people so that they would be able to take control of a commercial jet and do what we saw, what happened on Tuesday morning at the Trade Center and also at the Pentagon. What happened is it seems as though they found out that in Florida there are about 80 training schools, flight schools, and it's pretty easy to get in there, and most of the people there are foreigners. Excuse me. What they found out is if you have the money, you can get into the classes. And so obviously they were very well bankrolled. These are not cheap classes. Some of them go as much as $30,000, $40,000 for flight simulating. So what they did is they sent people over and gradually built up a network of people that were able to mount this sort of size of a conspiracy, because as we know, there were 4 flights. There may have been more that they wanted to get on. And there were more than one pilot on all of these, in all of these flights that were hijacked. There wasn't one. They were obviously banking that maybe there would have been a struggle and one of the trained pilots would not be able to take control. There was more than one pilot, one trained pilot, on all of the hijacked jets.
Now, you say whoever was behind this, as you know, the United States government has said that they definitively point the finger at Osama bin Laden, and it does appear that what you're describing, which is people who go into a country and stay in that country for a very long time, almost like sleeper agents, is a kind of fingerprint for Osama's past.
Certainly that's where the people in Washington are pointing, although it's still unclear whether a number of these people were Sunni Muslims or Shia Muslims. If in fact they were Sunni Muslims, then that would make sense that they were lined up with Mr. bin Laden. If in fact they are Shia Muslims, these are two groups that generally do not mix. So that is something that investigators are still trying to track down. The other thing we found out...
Let me just be clear, because a lot of people might not know quite what you mean. These are two different sects of Muslims. Osama bin Laden, being a Saudi, would be Sunni Muslim, and Shiite Muslims would be, for instance, Iranians.
Correct. And it's unclear. There's clearly there's an ethnic mix here from different Arabian groups here, and it's still unclear the number of nationals or the different countries that the people involved here came from. And talking to an investigator today, they've got one guy with a Saudi passport who had an Egyptian driver's license who may have been from the United Arab Emirates. So this is what they're up against, trying to piece this together.
Now, I've read some reporting that says that some of these people who were getting their flight training in Florida had used Saudi passports and had indicated that they were associated with Saudi Airlines, and that therefore they would not have received the kind of scrutiny that others would, because the Saudis, of course, are allies of the United States.
Exactly. We found that was a strong pattern in all of this. There are a number of it. At least half of the hijackers in the Boston cases either had Saudi passports or claimed the sponsorship or employment of Saudi Arabian Airlines. And I talked to a number of flight instructors in Florida today, and they said the way it works down there is if you apply for membership in these flight classes and say you're from Saudi Arabia, they just ship over an exemption paper, which the schools can issue directly to students. The students then take it to the U.S. Embassy or a U.S. consulate somewhere in Saudi Arabia, and it basically is rubber stamped. Now, we talked to the State Department tonight, and they denied that. They said that there's much more scrutiny than that would suggest. But everyone, I talked to several, I think I talked to 4 people who are either involved in training as flight instructors or involved in the aviation industry in Florida, and they all had a very same take on it, is that if you come from Saudi Arabia, either if they sponsor you or you have a Saudi passport, you basically get into the United States, no questions asked.
I'll tell you, Kevin, if you listen to your reporting and the other reporting that we have seen, if we talk about people who were on the ground for 5 years living normal lives, who have been, one presumes, cut out from the magnitude of the mission so that they effectively wouldn't know everything that was going on until a larger operative came into town to turn them on. If you talk about passports, if you talk about Saudi Airlines identifications, ramp passes, such as the one that was used at Logan Airport, this really is a sophisticated and expensive operation.
It's extraordinarily sophisticated and it's extraordinarily expensive, which raises the question, I think, as you raised, Forrest, who sponsors these guys? Where do they come from? They should not have that kind of money to throw around. One of the most extraordinary things about this is that we believe, we are led to believe that these are devout, fundamentalist Muslims who are making a sacrifice here, who are killing the infidels. And yet I talked to people in Florida, and several of my colleagues talked to people in Florida who report that these men were drinking in bar rooms, which if they did this in their host countries, such as Saudi Arabia, they would be subject to execution. So there's a very, very strange picture drawing here.
That's Kevin Cullen, who is with the Boston Globe and has a strong story along with Shelley Murphy in the Boston Globe papers just this morning about what was going on inside these terrorist cells, suspected terrorist cells. Couple of interesting bits passing over the transom this morning. New York officials are looking into those 10 people of Middle Eastern descent who were detained at New York airports LaGuardia and JFK on Thursday. Note this, some reportedly were carrying knives. And authorities are indeed investigating whether this may have been another attempted hijacking. It is believed, according to some U.S. officials, this now an Associated Press report, speaking on condition of anonymity, that there are some terrorists involved with Tuesday's plots who may very well still be at large. And one word from Russia. Prime Ministers of Russia, China, and the Central Asian states are saying that they are ready to fight the terrorism that devastated the United States this week. This includes Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan. Very important because they border along Afghanistan. They are opposed to the Taliban because their extremist form of the Muslim religion would be unsettling to those countries. However, they are saying that they did not discuss the scenario of U.S. strikes on Afghanistan, and of course the U.S. would want support in that. They say the consequences of that action in Central Asia has not yet been considered. Quoting the Kazakh Prime Minister, it is a bit premature to discuss this. These are the latest events just passing over the transom. Thursday, this is now Friday morning. Thursday was a very difficult day. Heavy rainstorms here in New York. The investigation moving forward slowly, tediously. Stone Phillips looks at the events in the attack on America.
Morning, 48 hours after the world exploded. 48 hours that seem like forever. New York City struggles to get back on its feet. For many, today is the first day back on the job, the first attempt at returning to life as it was. But how is that even possible?
Nothing could be quite normal, but this seems much more normal than it was yesterday.
There's no energy. People are just kind of like sleepwalking.
For tens of thousands of workers here, there is simply no office to go to. Their buildings reduced to rubble or crumbling masonry. The Twin Towers, gone. The 47-story tower at 7 World Trade Center, toppled. The 54-story tower at 1 Liberty Plaza, 3 blocks from the Trade Center, disintegrating. And numerous other buildings uninhabitable. 9 a.m. After a difficult morning commute, another transportation snarl as the investigation reaches across New York Harbor to Staten Island.
Staten Island has essentially been shut down. The bridges have been closed going in and out of that borough of New York. Why? It is believed that the car that was used by one of the hijackers named Mohammed Atta may be there on Staten Island. They're trying to locate it. In the meantime, they're not letting anybody go in or out of Staten Island.
In the tangled, still smoldering wreckage of the Trade Center towers, emergency teams continue their around-the-clock work. At about 10 a.m., the reason they are driving themselves to exhaustion.
I believe that there's a good possibility that there's people in that building that are alive, and that's why we are treating this as a rescue effort still. This is not a recovery. We are trying to get in every possible void, every possible area that we can to try to see if there are people that we can save.
But this morning's statistics threaten to overwhelm the flickering hopes of finding many alive amidst the tons of debris. New York Mayor Giuliani.
We now have a count of 94 bodies that have been recovered, 46 of which have been identified. We have the gruesome and horrible situation that in many cases we recover only parts of bodies, and we have 70 in that category.
Another number speaks graphically to the carnage. To hold all those pieces of the human wreckage, the mayor tells reporters that the city has waiting 30,000 body bags. And then there is the list of the missing.
We have 4,763 people on the missing persons list. That's a list that's as inclusive as we can make it. It includes the plane itself, the manifest. It includes people that have been identified to us by family members.
And all over the city, pictures handed out by desperate families. This is Tim Stout, a father of 3 who was working on the 103rd floor of the North Tower, one of 680 missing from his company alone. Michael Lepore's office was on the 97th floor. Missing from his firm, another 700. Their families are hoping to find them, even if it's in a hospital bed. That's where Arthur Del Bianco's family found him, his leg broken, his respect unbounded. for the courage of the rescuers.
The firemen were phenomenal. They're true heroes. They were there. They went back in over and over again. Even after the first building started coming down, those guys went back inside. They went back inside.
Do you have the sense that there are still people underground?
I want to believe that there's still people alive.
At the Pentagon this morning, the talk is no longer of people missing.
We're in what we call a recovery mode, which means that we're now trying to recover the remains of the body, make the situation as safe as we possibly can.
The death toll now estimated at 126 on the ground, 64 on the plane, diverted by hijackers into the west wall of